She stepped off the train with one trunk, $11, and a telegram that ended her future before it started. 7 words. That was all Gerald Puitt gave her. I've changed my mind. Don't come. By the time she finished reading it, the whole town already knew. They looked at her the way people look at something discarded. A woman no one wanted. A woman who had sold everything she owned to travel 2,000 miles for a man who couldn't even face her in person to say no. Most women would have taken the return ticket. Most women would have gone home. Clara Whitmore was not most women. What happened next, in the harshest corner of the Montana frontier on a broken ranch with 2 silent children and a man who had forgotten how to feel anything, is the kind of story that reminds you what one person is capable of when they decide that the worst moment of their life is not going to be the last one. Watch until the end. And if this story moves you, hit like, subscribe to join our family, and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The telegram had arrived 3 days before the train pulled into Harlan's Crossing, but Clara Whitmore didn't read it until she was already on the platform with her trunk at her feet and the August heat pressing down on her like a flat iron. She had been watching the mountains when the station master handed it to her. Those enormous, indifferent peaks rising up in every direction, nothing like the rolling Pennsylvania hills she had grown up looking at. She thought, this is where my life begins. She thought Gerald is probably already at the station, nervous, fidgeting with his collar the way his letters suggested he did when he was anxious. She thought a lot of things in those few seconds before she unfolded the paper. Then she read it. Miss Whitmore, I find I cannot proceed with our arrangement. Please do not come to the ranch. I am sorry for the inconvenience. G. Puitt. She read it twice, then a third time, slower, as if rereading it carefully might change the words. It didn't. The station master was still standing there, a heavy-set man with a gray mustache and the practiced expression of someone who had delivered bad news before and found it easier not to look directly at the recipient. You're the Whitmore woman, he said. The one coming to marry Gerald Puitt? Clara folded the telegram along its original crease. Apparently not anymore. Figured. He picked up a clipboard. He sent word 2 days ago. Asked me to pass that along when you stepped off. He paused. He paid for a return ticket if you want it. Leaves Thursday. Thursday was 4 days away. Clara looked at her trunk. It contained everything she had brought with her. 2 dresses, a winter coat, her mother's sewing kit, several books, and a small tin box with $11.40 inside. She had sold most of her other possessions to cover the journey west. The return ticket would get her back to Pittsburgh, back to the boarding house where she'd spent the last year after her father's death, back to the same narrow room with the same damp smell and the same landlady who charged by the week and didn't ask questions. No, she said. Thank you. The station master blinked. Ma'am? I don't want the return ticket. She picked up her traveling bag and nodded toward her trunk. Is there someone who can carry that to a hotel? There was a boy, 14 or so, who did it for 15 cents. He didn't speak to her during the walk into town, but she noticed him glancing at her sideways with the particular curiosity of someone who already knew something interesting about her. By the time they reached the Harlan Hotel, a 2-story building with peeling paint and a porch that sagged on the left side, Clara had begun to understand that in a town this small, the station master's conversation had probably traveled faster than she had. The woman at the front desk confirmed it. You're the one Gerald Puitt sent packing? She said. Not unkindly, exactly. More the way you'd say you're the one who fell off the horse, noting a fact with mild interest. He changed his mind, Clara said. I'd like a room, please. It's $4 a week, paid in advance. Clara counted $4 from her tin box at the counter. That left $7.40. The woman, her name was Mrs. Daly, a widow who ran the hotel with the help of her teenage daughter, slid a key across the desk and said, almost as an afterthought, You're not the first woman he's done this to. Gerald Puitt, just so you know. Clara looked at her. He's done it twice before, Mrs. Daly said. Writes to women back east, gets them to come out here, then backs out. Nobody knows why. Some say he's too afraid to actually go through with it. Some say his mother won't let him. She shrugged. Either way, You're not the first. This was meant, Clara thought, to be comforting. It was not comforting. She took her key and went upstairs. The room was small and faced the alley. There was a window that let in more heat than light, a bed with a thin mattress, a washstand, and a mirror with a crack running diagonally across the glass so that her reflection was split in two, her face in one half, the wall behind her in the other. She sat on the edge of the bed and let herself feel the full weight of what had happened. It wasn't grief, exactly. She had not loved Gerald Puitt. She had never met Gerald Puitt. What she had exchanged with him over 4 months of correspondence was a negotiated hope, careful letters that covered practical matters, that discussed the arrangement with the measured optimism of two adults who understood they were building something rather than feeling something. He'd seemed decent enough in his writing, reliable, the kind of man who included practical information about what to pack for a Montana winter and asked respectful questions about her experience with children, since he had a neighbor whose daughter needed tutoring. She had liked that, the practicality of it. But she had not loved him, and she did not love him now, and what she felt sitting on that sagging mattress in a cracked mirror's reflection was not heartbreak. It was something colder and more concrete. She was 29 years old, she had no family left, $7.40, and she was stranded in a town where everyone already knew her name attached to an embarrassing story. The woman Gerald Puitt didn't want. She got up and went to the window and looked out at the alley. A cat was picking through a garbage pile with focused, unhurried concentration. Clara watched it and thought, at least someone in this town knows what they're doing. She made a list in her head. She was good at list. She needed work. She needed it quickly. She had some experience. She had been a school teacher in Pennsylvania for 3 years before her father's illness pulled her home to care for him. And she had done private tutoring after that. She could cook, sew, keep accounts. She was not helpless. She was not going back. In the morning, she went looking for work. Igman. Harlan's Crossing was not a large town, but it had the particular social density of small settlements where everyone knows everyone and strangers are interesting, the way a stone thrown into still water is interesting, mostly because of the ripples. Clara walked its main street with her chin up and her eyes open, taking in the hardware store, the feed store, the dry goods, the lawyer's office, the doctor's office, the saloon, 2 of them actually, which she noted as a sign of either great thirst or great boredom, or both. She started with the mercantile because they had a handwritten sign in the window. Part-time help wanted, inquire within. The man behind the counter was maybe 50, with the look of someone who had spent 20 years doing arithmetic in his head. He looked at her over his spectacles when she came in, and she saw the slight shift in his expression, a flicker of recognition, then something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite contempt but occupied the uncomfortable territory between them. "Help with what?" she asked, nodding at the sign. "Stocking, inventory, some bookkeeping when my wife's not available." "I can do all of that. I kept accounts for my father's dry goods business for 6 years." This was not entirely accurate. She had helped with accounts, which was not the same as running them, but she could learn quickly and she knew it. He studied her for a moment. "You're the Whitmore woman." "I am." "Gerald Puitt's?" "That arrangement fell through. I'm looking for work." He took his spectacles off and cleaned them, which she had already understood was a stalling gesture men used when they wanted to say something they hadn't quite decided to say yet. "Town's not big," he said finally. "People talk. A woman who came out here to marry someone who didn't want her. That's the kind of thing people talk about." "People can talk while I stock shelves," Clara said. He almost smiled. Almost. Then he put his spectacles back on and said, "I'll think about it. Come back Friday." She went to the doctor's office next. The doctor was a young man who seemed genuinely harried and not particularly interested in social dynamics. He just needed someone who could read and write well enough to help keep records. She thought she'd done reasonably well in the 5 minutes they spoke before his waiting room interrupted him. But when she came back the next day, his receptionist, a narrow-faced woman in her 40s named Mrs. Greer, told her the position had been filled. The position had not been filled. Clara could see through the window that the waiting room was empty and the doctor was sitting alone at his desk. She did not make a scene. She thanked Mrs. Greer and left. The schoolhouse was the next logical stop. It was a single-room building at the edge of town, and the woman who ran it, Mrs. Fortner, late 50s, the kind of iron-spined educator who had probably been teaching since before half her students' parents were born, looked at Clara with something that might have been professional evaluation and might have been skepticism, and was probably both. "I taught for 3 years in Allegheny County," Clara said. "Primary grades. I'm qualified." "I have no positions," Mrs. Fortner said. "Are you sure?" "Because I understood from the hotel that the school has been short-staffed since—" "I have no positions," Mrs. Fortner repeated, with the particular finality of a woman who has made a decision and will not be unsettled from it by logic. "I'm sorry for your situation, Miss Whitmore. I am. But this is a small community and families here. They want stability. Teachers who are settled, not women passing through." "I'm not passing through." "You've been here 2 days." "Yes, and I intend to be here considerably longer." Mrs. Fortner looked at her with something that might have been a fragment of respect, buried under many layers of other things. "Come back in the spring," she said. "If you're still here in the spring, we'll talk." Spring was 7 months away. Chub. By the 3rd day, Clara had spoken to 9 potential employers. 3 had been politely dismissive. 2 had been less politely dismissive. 1, the owner of the laundry, had offered her work that amounted to 14 hours a day for 50 cents, which was less than what she could get in Pennsylvania, and suggested he was operating on the assumption that desperation had no floor. She turned him down. She was counting her remaining money on the 4th evening, $6.55 now, after meals and a small bottle of ink, when she heard loud voices from the street below. Nothing unusual at first, but then the sounds shifted into something with a harder edge, and she went to the window. 2 men she didn't recognize were walking a woman down the boardwalk, one on either side of her. The woman was trying to pull free without creating a scene, which meant she kept her movement small and her voice low, but Clara could see from the set of her shoulders that this was not a friendly situation. Clara watched for another moment, then went downstairs. By the time she got to the street, the 2 men had steered the woman toward the entrance of the closer saloon, the one called the Bear's Head, with its sign painted in flaking red letters. Clara followed. She would think about this later, what exactly she had intended to do. She had no plan. She had no weapon. She had no particular physical advantage over 2 men who were both larger than her. What she had was the same thing she'd had her whole life, a very low tolerance for watching someone be pushed around and doing nothing about it. Inside, the saloon had the usual evening population, a dozen men at tables, a bartender, a card game in the corner that had gotten loud. The 2 men had the woman backed against the bar, and one of them, heavy-shouldered, with a red beard that needed attention, was saying something that made her face go stiff and frightened. Clara crossed the room to the bar. "Excuse me," she said. The red-bearded man turned. He had the look of someone who had started drinking early in the afternoon and found a comfortable plateau. "What?" "I need to speak to my friend." He looked at Clara the way men like him looked at women who intruded on situations they hadn't been invited into, with a slow, contemptuous appraisal that was meant to communicate both power and dismissal. "Your friend," he said. "That right?" "That's right." Clara turned to the woman. "Eliza, I've been looking for you everywhere. Mrs. Daly needs us back by 7. The woman, who was not named Eliza and was not anyone Clara had ever met, understood immediately. She straightened slightly and said, I'm sorry, I got held up." The red-bearded man's companion, shorter and meaner looking, put his hand on the bar between them. "Nobody asked you to come in here." "I'm not talking to you," Clara said. "Eliza, let's go." "She's not going anywhere," the red-bearded man said. "And neither are you, since you walked in here yourself." He smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. "Town knows who you are, sweetheart. Woman Gerald Puit didn't want. Not much negotiating power for someone like that." The bar had gotten quiet. The card game in the corner had stopped. Clara felt the particular clarifying cold of real fear. Not anxiety, not discomfort, but the actual animal recognition of a dangerous situation. She held it at arm's length, the way she'd taught herself to over the years, and kept her expression level. "My negotiating power," she said, "is not what you should be thinking about right now." "No?" He leaned forward. What should I be thinking about? How this ends, she said, because I'm not the only one who walked in here, and you've been loud enough that everyone in this room knows exactly what's happening, which means when I leave, and I am leaving with my friend, everyone in here is going to know whether you let us go or whether you didn't, and that's going to follow you around this town for a while. It was a bluff. She was not entirely sure it would work, but she had noticed, in the few seconds since she'd walked in, that the bartender had taken a half step back from the two men, and the card players in the corner had rotated their chairs slightly in this direction, which meant the room's sympathy, such as it was, might not be entirely with the red-bearded man. The silence stretched. Then a voice from behind her said quietly, "She's right. That's how this ends." Clara didn't turn around immediately. She watched the red-bearded man's face instead and saw something shift in it. Not retreat exactly, but recalculation. She turned. The man who had spoken was standing near the door, which put him a good 10 feet away. He was tall, not heavily built, wearing a rancher's worn work coat with dust on the shoulders. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, and the kind of face that looked like it had spent most of its time outdoors making practical decisions rather than saying much. He wasn't threatening the red-bearded man. He wasn't even looking at him directly. He was just standing there still, with his hat in his hand, and something in the absolute flatness of his posture suggested that he had placed himself in this room for a specific reason and had no particular plans to move until that reason resolved itself. "Cole Mercer," the red-bearded man said, and the contempt in his voice had acquired a slight undertone that wasn't quite respect but occupied the same neighborhood. "Frank," the other man said. Nothing else. The red-bearded man, Frank, made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Then he picked up his drink and turned back toward the bar, as though he'd simply lost interest. His companion sat back down. The card game resumed. Clara looked at the woman beside her. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she exhaled. "Yes, thank you. Thank you." "Go out the front," Clara said. "I'll follow in a minute." The woman went. Clara turned and walked toward the door, and the man named Cole Mercer stepped back to let her pass. She stopped when she drew even with him, because courtesy required it. "Thank you," she said. "You were handling it," he said. He said it without particular inflection. Not flattery, not dismissal, just an observation. "I was hoping to," she said. He nodded once, the kind of nod that didn't mean anything specific, and looked at his hat for a moment. "You're the woman who came to marry Gerald Puit." She was beginning to think she would be answering to that description for the rest of her time in this town. The arrangement fell through. "I'm looking for work." Something moved behind his eyes. Not pity, which was what she'd been bracing for. Something more like assessment. He put his hat back on. "I have 2 boys," he said, 9 and 11. "Neither one of them has said more than 10 words to anyone in the past year." He paused. "They need a teacher. Someone patient." Clara looked at him steadily. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you walked into a saloon to pull a stranger out of trouble," he said, "and the way you talked to Frank Odell took more nerve than most men I know would have shown." He looked toward the door. "The job's room and board plus $4 a week. Ranch is 12 miles out." He looked back at her. "Take it or leave it. I need to decide tonight." $4 a week was not much. It was not the station master's return ticket either. $4 a week, and I want the use of a horse on Sundays, Clara said. Something that was almost a slight change in expression crossed his face. "Fine," he said. "My wagon leaves at 7 tomorrow morning." He walked out. Clara stood in the saloon doorway for a moment. The bartender was wiping glasses again. Frank Odell had turned his back. The card game had gotten loud again. She went back to the hotel to pack her trunk. She did not sleep well that night. The mattress was the same thin mattress it had been the previous nights. The heat was the same. The cracked mirror caught the lamplight the same diagonal way. But something else was different. Some quality of her own alertness that kept pulling her out of sleep and dropping her back into the dark room wide awake. She lay there and made herself think through what she knew, which was not much. A rancher named Cole Mercer, who'd spoken 4 sentences total and made a job offer without any of the usual preamble or qualification, suggesting he was either very direct or very desperate or both. 2 boys who hadn't spoken in a year, a ranch 12 miles out, room and board. She did not know why the boys had stopped speaking. She did not know what had happened to their mother, though something in the way he'd said they need someone patient suggested that patience had been in short supply, and the reason for that was probably not cheerful. She did not know anything about the land, the ranch, the nearest neighbors, or what room and board actually translated to in terms of livable conditions. What she knew was that it was better than $6.45, and no prospects in a town that had already decided what kind of woman she was based on a telegram she hadn't written. She turned on her side and watched the ceiling and made a different list. Things she would need to establish clearly before the end of the first week. Her role, what she would and would not be responsible for. Her hours, her autonomy. She'd learned, the hard way, that the things people don't say in an agreement are usually the things that cause the most problems later. A man who offered her a position out of the blue, at night, in a saloon, with no written agreement and no witnesses, was either a man of simple, practical intentions or a man who preferred arrangements that weren't written down. She would find out which by paying attention. She fell asleep somewhere around midnight and woke again before 5. When the sky outside was still dark and the alley cat from the garbage pile was making noise. She dressed, wrote a brief note to Mrs. Daly settling the remainder of her account, and carried her trunk downstairs before anyone else was stirring. At 7:10, Cole Mercer's wagon appeared at the end of the street. He drove it himself, no ranch hand accompanying him, and pulled up in front of the hotel without ceremony. He looked at her trunk, then at her. "That everything?" he said. "Yes." He got down from the wagon and lifted the trunk into the back without asking her help or commenting on its weight. She climbed up to the seat herself, and he got up beside her and turned the wagon without any preamble or small talk. They drove in silence for the first 20 minutes, which Clara found either compatible or uncomfortable depending on how she looked at it. The land opened up as they left town, wider and more raw than she'd expected, the grass dry and bleached by late summer heat, the mountains hovering in the north like weather that hadn't decided to move yet. "The boys," she said finally. "What are their names?" "Noah. He's 11. Levi is 9. What happened to their mother?" He was quiet for a moment. "Fire," he said. 3 years ago. "I'm sorry." He didn't say anything to that. She didn't press. "Are they frightened of strangers?" she asked. "Or is it something else?" He glanced at her sideways. "Something else. What?" Another pause. The wagon wheels found a rut, and he corrected for it without looking down. "They had a woman come out to help last year. She left after 2 weeks. Said the boys were too difficult." "Were they difficult?" "They were grieving," he said, with a flatness to his voice that told her this was not a conclusion he'd arrived at easily or quickly. "I didn't see it that way at first." She looked at the road ahead of them. "What made you see it that way eventually?" He didn't answer that one either, but he didn't look uncomfortable, just thoughtful, in the way of someone who considered silence a legitimate response to a question that was too large for a wagon ride. Clara filed it away and let it go for now. They rode on. The mountains didn't get any closer. They never seemed to, out here, no matter how long you moved toward them. But the land changed, grew more textured. She began to see signs of grazing, worn paths through the grass, scattered fence posts, a windmill in the distance turning slowly in a wind she couldn't feel yet. "Mercer Flat," he said, and she realized he was identifying the land they were now on. "My father settled it in 1867. Is it good land?" "Was," he said. Then a moment later, "Still can be." She heard something in those 2 sentences that she chose not to follow up on. Not yet. There was time. If this arrangement lasted more than a week, and she intended it to, there would be time. When the ranch house appeared around a long curve in the road, it was nothing like what she'd imagined. She'd prepared herself for something rough, frontier construction, makeshift functional rather than comfortable. And it was functional, certainly, and not new. But it was larger than she'd expected and had the look of a place that had once been cared for and was now being maintained by someone who was doing the best they could with limited time and no particular help. Two figures were standing on the porch. Even from a distance, she could see they were boys. One taller, one shorter. The older one with his arms crossed and his chin at the particular defensive angle of a child who had decided before anything happened that he didn't like it. The younger one was closer to the porch railing, watching the wagon approach with the kind of attention that looked more like fear than curiosity. Cole pulled the wagon up and got down. He didn't look at the boys immediately, just walked around to the back of the wagon and lifted out her trunk. "Noah," he said, without turning. "Levi, this is Miss Whitmore. She's going to be staying with us for a while." The older boy, Noah, said nothing. He looked at Clara with an expression that she'd seen before on children who'd been disappointed by adults enough times to have developed a policy about it. Expect the worst, and you won't be caught off guard. The younger one, Levi, looked at her with his big solemn eyes and said nothing at all. Clara got down from the wagon and looked at them both directly. Not smiling too broadly, not performing warmth she hadn't earned. Just looking, the way you'd look at anyone you'd just met and were making up your mind about. "Noah," she said. "Levi." She used their names because she'd found that children paid attention when adults actually used their names instead of gesturing at them. "I'm not sure how much your father told you, but I haven't been in Montana long enough to know what I'm doing here yet. I expect that'll take some time to figure out." Neither of them answered. That was fine. She hadn't asked a question. She picked up her traveling bag because Cole had already taken her trunk to the porch, and she walked toward the house. She didn't know yet what she was walking into. She knew the outline. 2 grieving children, a man who kept himself behind walls, a ranch that had seen better days, and something she hadn't been told yet about the land and whoever wanted it. She knew it wouldn't be clean or simple or anything like what she'd imagined when she was still on the train watching those mountains come up on the horizon. But she was here. She hadn't gotten back on the train. She climbed the porch steps and waited for Cole Mercer to open the door, and when he did, she went inside. The inside of the house told her things Cole Mercer hadn't. It wasn't dirty, exactly. Someone swept the floors and kept the dishes from piling up. But it had the specific quality of a place where practical necessity had replaced anything that wasn't strictly necessary. The curtains were plain and faded. The table had a water ring on it that had been there long enough to become permanent. There were no rugs. There was a shelf with a few books on it, most of them showing the swollen spines of volumes that had gotten wet once and dried wrong. On the wall near the kitchen doorway, someone had penciled 2 sets of height marks at different intervals, the kind parents made on door frames to track their children's growing, and the last marks on both sets were dated 3 years back, and below them were 2 names written in a hand that wasn't Cole's. The handwriting was rounder, more careful. A woman's hand. Clara didn't say anything about it. She set her traveling bag down and looked at the main room and made note of what she was working with. Cole showed her the room she'd be using, small, off the kitchen, with a single window that looked out at the back of the barn. There was a bed, a chest of drawers, and a hook on the wall. It was adequate. She said so. "Meals are at 6, noon, and 6, he said, standing in the doorway. "The boys wake early. I'm usually in the fields or the barn by 5. "Who's been cooking?" "Noah, mostly. I do it when I'm in early enough." She considered that. An 11-year-old cooking for a family of 3 was not necessarily a bad thing. It could teach a child a great deal, but it was also a significant weight to put on someone that age, and she filed it away along with the height marks on the wall. "I'll handle breakfast," she said, "if that's all right." He looked at her as if trying to decide whether she was offering out of strategy or kindness, then gave the same minimal nod she was coming to recognize as his primary mode of agreement. "Fine," he said, and left her to unpack. She could hear the boys in the main room, not talking, just moving, a chair scraping, the sound of something being set down on the table. She took her time putting her things away, because she'd learned that with children who didn't trust you, the worst thing you could do in the first hour was push. Heck, dinner that first night was a study in the particular silence of people who don't know what to do with each other. Cole had made a beef stew that was functional rather than good. Overcooked, underseasoned, the vegetables gone soft in a way that suggested it had been on too long. Noah ate without looking up from his bowl. Levi ate slowly, with the careful attention of a child who had somewhere learned to eat, as though the food might disappear if he moved too fast. Clara ate what was in front of her without complaint, and didn't fill the silence with unnecessary talk. She'd learned early in her teaching years that children could hear performance, could sense the particular quality of an adult trying too hard, and that it made them retreat. So she just ate and looked out the window at the sky going orange over the mountains. And when Noah reached across the table for the bread without asking, she handed it to him before he had to stretch, and he took it without acknowledgement. "This bread is good," she said to the table in general, because it was dense and slightly sweet, not like the flat, tasteless loaves the hotel had served. "Who made it?" Silence. Then Levi, without looking up, said, "Noah." It was the first word either of them had said to her. Noah's jaw tightened slightly, as if being credited with something was its own kind of exposure. He didn't say anything, but he didn't deny it either. "Good technique," Clara said. "Most people don't get the rise right without a proper warm spot to proof the dough. Where do you do it?" Nothing. She let it go and ate her stew. After dinner, Cole went back outside, something with the horses that apparently needed attention, and Clara cleared the table while Noah stood by the kitchen basin with his arms crossed, watching her with the expression of someone who had decided to be skeptical and was waiting for evidence that he'd been right. "You don't have to stand there," she said. "I can clean up." "That's my job," he said. "I know. I'm doing it tonight." She glanced at him. "You can stand there if you want. It's not bothering me." He stood there for a moment longer, apparently determining whether she was trying to trap him somehow, then walked out. Levi appeared in the doorway shortly afterward and watched her in a different way. Quieter, more interior, the way some children watch things they weren't sure were safe to approach directly. She washed dishes and didn't look at him because she'd found that children who were frightened of being noticed sometimes found it easier to stay in a room if you didn't make eye contact. "There's a crack in that cup," he said finally, pointing at one she'd set on the drying rack. "I see it. Is it still used?" "Papa uses it every morning." "Then it still works," she said. "Things can be cracked and still useful." He seemed to think about this with great seriousness. Then he went to bed without another word. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning, and she recognized it as one. She had been at Mercer Flat Ranch for 4 days before she understood the shape of what she had walked into. The mornings were the easiest part. She got up before the boys and had the stove going by 5:30, and by the time Noah came out, always first, always dressed, always already wearing the expression of someone braced for the day, there was oatmeal and coffee and sometimes eggs if the hens had cooperated. He never said thank you for the first 2 days. On the 3rd day, he said, "There's more salt in the left tin," and she understood this was the closest she was going to get to a compliment for a while, and she thanked him and used more salt. Levi came down later, slower, sometimes still pulling at his sleeve the way children did when they'd woken from a dream they couldn't quite shake. He ate everything she put in front of him without complaint. He never asked for more. She started giving him a larger portion without being asked, and he ate that too, and one morning she caught him watching her serve his plate with an expression she recognized. The careful attention of a child who has learned not to expect things and is still not entirely sure how to handle it when they happen. Teaching them was a different matter. She had set up a rough classroom in the main room, cleared the table, brought in 2 chairs of the right height, organized what she found in the house by way of learning materials, which was not much. Some arithmetic primers, a battered geography book, a Bible she set aside without comment since she had no intention of using it as curriculum. She'd written letters home to Philadelphia the first week, asking a former colleague to send whatever basic materials she could spare, and she'd ordered 2 more books from the general store in Harlan's Crossing using 70 cents of her own money, which she couldn't really afford but considered an investment. Noah sat down at the table on the first morning of lessons with the expression of someone tolerating a procedure they'd been told was necessary. He already knew how to read, well, actually better than most 11-year-olds she'd encountered, and he could do arithmetic fast in his head with an accuracy that suggested he did it habitually. He answered her questions in the minimum number of words required and waited, with poorly concealed impatience, for her to ask something harder. Levi, she discovered, had trouble reading, not because he was unintelligent, His memory was extraordinary. He could repeat back conversations she'd had at breakfast with the fidelity of someone who'd written them down, but something in the process of translating letters on a page into sound tripped him up in a way that went beyond practice and patience. She noted this carefully and set aside the primers and started teaching him differently, reading aloud herself, having him tell the story back, building from what he was naturally good at toward what was harder. She didn't tell Cole any of this for the first week. She was still understanding it herself. What she told him when they crossed paths in the evenings was minimal and practical. How the morning had gone, whether the boys had eaten, if anything on the ranch needed attention that she'd noticed. He listened, said little, and went back to whatever work had accumulated. He was not a talkative man under the best circumstances, and the evenings made him more closed. She could see the fatigue in him, but underneath the fatigue was something else, something she recognized without being able to name. The particular weight of a person who has been holding too many things for too long and has forgotten that it's something anyone could help with. She did not try to help with it yet. That wasn't her business, and she knew it. What became her business, faster than she'd expected, was the ranch itself. On the 5th day, a man arrived. She was outside with Levi. They'd taken the morning's lesson outdoors because the weather had finally broken, and it seemed wrong to sit inside. When a horse came up the main road at a pace that was slightly too deliberate, the way people rode when they wanted to look unhurried but weren't. The man who dismounted was maybe 50, heavy-set without being soft, in a coat that cost more than anything in Cole's house. He had a wide face and the practiced ease of someone who had spent a long time in situations that required him to seem reasonable. He didn't look at Levi. He looked at Clara. "Cole Mercer around?" he said, not asking exactly, more confirming. "He's in the north field," she said. "Is there something I can help you with?" "Victor Aldane." He said it the way men said their names when they expected the name to do some work for them. "I have business with Mercer." "I can let him know you're here," Clara said. She was aware of Levi going very still beside her, the way animals went still when something predatory came too close. It told her something about how often this man had visited and what the visits had felt like to the people living here. "No need to bother," Aldane said pleasantly. "I'll ride out to him." He looked at the house briefly, then back at her. "You're new?" "I work here," she said. "Doing what?" "Teaching the boys." He nodded slowly, with the look of someone filing information. "Cole's doing well then. Good to see." He tipped his hat and rode off toward the north field, and Clara watched him go with a feeling she couldn't immediately account for. Something between ordinary wariness and something sharper, more specific. She looked down at Levi. His book was closed on his lap. His eyes were still tracking Aldane's retreating figure. "You know him?" she asked. Levi picked up his book and opened it to the page they'd been on. "He wants our land," he said. He said it the way children said things they'd overheard, not with dramatic weight, but with the flat, matter-of-fact certainty of someone who had absorbed information over time and had no context for how unusual it was to know it. He bent over his book again, tracing the words with his finger. Clara looked toward the north field for a moment, then sat back down across from him. "All right," she said. "Where were we?" She asked Cole about it that evening. He was at the table with a map of the property. Making notes in pencil that she could see from across the room were actually calculations. Acreage, something about water rights, numbers that didn't quite add up the way he wanted them to. She set a cup of coffee near his elbow, which she'd started doing 3 days ago because she'd noticed he forgot to drink anything between noon and 8 at night when he was working, and sat down across from him. "Victor Aldane came today," she said. He didn't look up from the map. "I know. He found me." "What did he want?" Cole set his pencil down. He had the look of someone deciding how much to explain, weighing it against how much she actually needed to know to do her job. Clara held his gaze steadily, because she'd found that people who were deciding whether to tell you something usually made up their minds based on whether you looked like someone who could handle it. "He wants the eastern section of the property," Cole said. "The part that runs down to Flat Creek." "For what?" "Water rights, mostly. He's been buying up land along that creek for 2 years, 5 properties already." Mine's the last piece he needs to control the whole water source for this part of the valley. He picked up his pencil again, turned it in his fingers without writing anything. He's made offers, reasonable ones, on paper. But if he controls the water, he controls what everyone downstream can do with their land. That means the Hendersons and the Pratt family and 6 other ranches that depend on that flow. He looked at the map. He's not buying land. He's buying leverage. Clara thought about this. Has he said what he'll do with the leverage once he has it? Men like Aldane don't say things like that. They just do them. Have you talked to a lawyer? Yes? Something moved across his face. The lawyer suggested I consider selling. She looked at him. The lawyer is probably on Aldane's payroll. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, That thought had occurred to me. Then you need a different lawyer. Nearest one I trust is in Helena, which is a long trip and costs money I don't have in surplus right now. He said it without self-pity. Just the flat delivery of a practical problem he'd been turning over for longer than was comfortable. Aldane's been patient. He'll keep being patient. That's what concerns me more than the offers. Why? Because patient men, Cole said, aren't waiting for you to come around. They're waiting for you to run out of options. She thought about that for a while after he went to bed. She sat at the table with the map in front of her and looked at the way the creek cut through the eastern edge of the property, and she understood what she was looking at in a way she hadn't before she sat down. This was not just a job. She had walked into something with more weight to it than teaching arithmetic and making oatmeal. She was living on land that someone powerful wanted, and that someone was patient, and patience in a person like that was not a virtue. It was a tactic. She folded the map back the way she'd found it and went to bed. In the weeks that followed, the ranch settled into something that wasn't yet comfortable but had started to have a rhythm to it. The particular rhythm of people who have to coexist and are slowly figuring out the least painful way to do it. Noah was the harder one. She'd known that from the start, and she'd been right. He was not a difficult child in the way that some children were difficult. He wasn't cruel or dishonest or prone to outbursts. He was simply defended in a way that had calcified over 3 years into something that looked a lot like indifference but wasn't. She caught glimpses of it sometimes. The way he read a book so thoroughly he forgot to notice time passing, or the way he'd repaired a broken hinge on the barn door with a piece of wire and 2 nails in a configuration she hadn't seen before, and that worked better than the original. He was an engineer by nature. He saw how things fit together and went wrong and could be fixed, and he did it quietly, without announcing it, because he'd apparently learned that announcing things led to having to talk about them. She started leaving problems for him. Not homework, exactly. Nothing that felt like school. She'd say at breakfast, "The window latch in my room doesn't catch properly," or "I can't figure out why the rain barrel keeps tipping," and then go about her day. By afternoon, the thing was always fixed, in ways she could learn from if she paid attention to how he'd done it. She never made a big point of noticing. She just said, "That's better," and moved on. She wasn't sure he noticed her not making a big point of it. But one afternoon, she came out of the house to find him sitting on the porch steps with a notebook, drawing something. Precise, detailed, mechanical. And he didn't close it when she came out. He just slid it to the side. That was enough. Levi was a different kind of challenge, slower and more internal. His reading was improving, but by increments small enough that he sometimes couldn't see them himself, which led to the particular frustration of a child who is trying hard and not sure if it's working. She had started writing down single sentences on slips of paper, not from primers, from things that had actually happened that day, things he'd actually said or done, and having him read those back. The brown hen got out of the fence again. Levi caught her by the south gate. Sentences with his own name in them, describing things he'd actually done. His eyes tracked differently when he read those, more steadily, less panicked. She mentioned this to Cole one evening, carefully, without framing it as a problem. "He learns differently than Noah," she said. "That's not a deficiency, it's just a different route to the same place." Cole was quiet. "He's going to need more time with reading than most children his age," she continued, "but his memory is remarkable, and he understands patterns. I've watched him work out Cole's calculations just by looking at the figures on your map for 5 minutes." Cole looked at her. "He looked at the map?" He said you'd left it out. I don't think he knew it was private. It wasn't private. He was quiet again, but a different kind of quiet than usual. Less closed, more something she didn't have a word for yet. He used to do that when he was younger, work things out in his head before anyone else had started writing them down. She didn't push any further. She let it sit there between them, the way you left something on a shelf for someone to pick up when they were ready. But October came with cold that arrived suddenly and without apology, the way Montana cold did. Not a gradual cooling, but a shift that happened overnight, leaving frost on the window glass and ice in the water barrel by morning. Clara adapted. She'd brought a good winter coat and she added layers beneath it, and she reorganized the kitchen to make the stove more central to the morning routine because warmth was a resource that needed to be managed. The boys adapted too, or they'd already adapted before she got there. Children who grew up on frontier ranches either learned to work with the land's rhythms or they didn't survive the education. Noah took on the additional morning task of breaking the water barrel ice without being asked. Levi started appearing downstairs earlier, which she suspected had more to do with not wanting to be alone in the cold bedroom than with any newfound enthusiasm for mornings, but she didn't comment on it. Cole worked longer hours than she thought was sustainable, though she kept this opinion to herself. He came in later, ate faster, went back out before full dark. She could see the tension in him accumulating the way pressure accumulated in closed systems. Not dramatic, just steadily compressing. She caught him once at the kitchen window, very late, standing still with his coffee cup in his hand, looking at nothing, or looking at something she couldn't see from the doorway. She went back to bed without disturbing him. But the boys saw it too. She caught Noah watching his father the same way Clara sometimes did, with the particular attention of a person trying to read a situation and not getting enough information to do it well. He was too old to be comforted by not knowing and too young to know what to do with what he could see. That was its own kind of painful to watch. One afternoon, after lessons, she asked Noah if he wanted to walk out to the creek. He looked at her. Why? I want to see the eastern boundary. I haven't been that far yet. It's cold. Yes, she agreed. He went and got his coat. They walked out in the thin autumn light through the dry grass, past the fence line that marked the end of the managed pasture and into the rougher scrub that ran down to the water. The creek was low but running, and she could see immediately why it mattered, the way the land sloped toward it, how many acres depended on that drainage, how a person who controlled this point could control what happened to everything downstream. Your father's right to hold on to it, she said. Noah looked at the water for a moment. Haldane came back last week, he said, while you were in town. She'd been to Harlan's Crossing for supplies. She hadn't known about a visit. What did he say? I don't know. I wasn't supposed to be listening. He picked up a flat stone and looked at it. Papa was quieter after. He worries about you and Levi, she said. Not just the land. Noah turned the stone over in his hands. He doesn't say things like that. No, she agreed. He doesn't say much. He used to. Noah set the stone down without throwing it. When Mama was alive, he talked more. He said it with the even, factual tone that children sometimes used for things that hurt too much to say with feeling. She talked a lot, so he did too, I think. Clara looked at the creek. She was loud, Noah said, and something at the edge of his voice shifted almost imperceptibly, like a door that had opened a quarter inch. Not bad loud, she said things, all the time, about whatever she was thinking. And he paused. Levi's like her. And you? He shrugged. Papa says I take after his father. Is that good? He says his father built this ranch from nothing, Noah said. So I guess it depends. They walked back in the cold, not saying much, but something had changed between them. Something very small, almost invisible, but real. Like a crack in a cup that still worked. He walked slightly closer to her than he had on the way out, close enough that their arms almost touched in the narrow path through the scrub, and he didn't move away from it. She was careful not to make anything of it, but it was in the second week of October that Cole knocked on her door after supper. She had been writing letters, correspondence she kept up with her former colleague in Pennsylvania and with a newspaper editor in Helena she'd written to on an impulse she hadn't fully examined yet. She put the letters under her book when she heard the knock, not because she was hiding them, but because she wasn't ready to explain them yet. "Come in." He stood in the doorway. He had his hat in his hands, which she'd noticed he did when he was thinking about something he wasn't sure how to say. "Levi's reading," he said. "I know, he's been—" "No." He shook his head slightly. "I mean, he's in his room right now, reading, out loud to himself." He paused. "He hasn't done that since a long time." Clara looked at him. "I just wanted to say something about it," he said. "I didn't know what exactly." He looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. "Whatever you're doing, it's working." She thought about all the things she could say in response to that. The small incremental approaches, the individually written sentences, the patience that wasn't really patience but just conviction that Levi was capable. She thought about Noah at the creek that afternoon, setting down the stone without throwing it. "They're not broken," she said. "They were never broken. They just needed time to believe someone was going to stay." Cole was quiet. "I'm staying," she said. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. Something too complicated to name, built out of too many things, some of which she recognized and some of which she didn't. Then he nodded once and pulled the door partway closed behind him as he left. And she heard his footsteps go down the hall and stop outside the boys' room. And then she heard something she hadn't heard once in the 5 weeks she'd been at Mercer Flat Ranch. Levi's voice, reading aloud. And then, after a moment, Cole's voice, low, quiet, the words indistinct through the wall, answering him. She went back to her letters, and outside the wind came down off the mountains, and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and inside the ranch house on the edge of Mercer Flat, something that had been frozen for 3 years had begun, very quietly, to move. The first sign that Aldane had shifted tactics came on a Tuesday in early November, when Clara went to Harlan's Crossing for supplies and found that the general store had canceled her standing order. Not her order specifically. She understood that quickly enough. The store owner, a man named Birch, who had always been cordial, if not warm, wouldn't meet her eyes when he told her. He straightened things behind the counter that didn't need straightening and said, "I'm afraid I can't extend credit to the Mercer account anymore. Nothing personal, just business." "We don't use credit," Clara said. "I pay cash." "Policy change." He picked up a tin and set it down in a different place. "I'm sorry, Miss Whitmore." She bought what she could from the small amount she'd brought and walked out. She stood on the boardwalk for a moment in the cold, looking at the street, thinking it through. Birch had been selling to Cole Mercer for at least a decade. She'd heard Cole mention it once as a point of established fact, the kind of relationship that accumulated through simple repetition and reliability. It didn't change overnight because of a policy. It changed because someone told him to change it. She went to the feed store next, where she got the same stiffness, the same avoidance of eye contact, the same vague language about new arrangements. At the dry goods, she was told they were out of several items that were clearly visible on the shelf behind the counter. By the time she climbed back into the wagon, she had enough to understand the shape of what was happening. Aldane was tightening the practical screws. He wasn't making dramatic moves. He was making the small, grinding, invisible kind that were harder to fight because there was nothing specific to point to. No threat. No legal document. Just a quiet word in the right ears, a small favor called in here, a business relationship gently redirected there. The kind of pressure that was designed to look like nothing from the outside while making everything harder on the inside. She drove back to the ranch faster than usual. Cole took it better than she expected, which is to say he received the information with the same flat expression he received most information, sat with it for a moment, and then said, "Birch owes Aldane money. I've known that for 2 years." "Then you knew this could happen?" "I knew it was possible." He was at the table again, not looking at the map this time, just looking at the table. "I thought I had more time." "More time for what?" "To put enough away that it didn't matter." He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture she'd seen him make when something had gotten past the point of being reworked in his head into something manageable. "Winter's the worst time for this. I can't drive to Helena for supplies every week. Roads close. And if he's gotten to Birch, he's probably gotten to the mill too, which means—" "I know what it means," she said. He looked at her. "We need to talk to the neighbors," she said. The Hendersons, the Pratts, the others who depend on the creek. If Aldane is doing this to you, he's likely doing pieces of it to them too, or he will be. They won't want to get involved. If they stand with me and Aldane wins, they lose their water access. If they don't stand with you and Aldane wins, they lose their water access anyway, she said. The difference is the timeline. Cole was quiet. I'm not telling you what to do, she said, because she'd been careful about that from the beginning. This was his land, his children, his risk. I'm telling you what I see. I know you're not, he said. And then, after a moment, you're right about the neighbors. I've been thinking the same thing. I just haven't... He stopped. Gone to them, she finished. It's not easy to ask people to put themselves in the middle of something. No, she agreed. It's not. He went the following Saturday. He didn't take Clara, which was correct. Those were his relationships, his community, his history with those men stretching back years, and she had no business inserting herself into negotiations she wasn't part of. She stayed at the ranch with the boys and used the time to continue a project she hadn't told Cole about yet. She had been writing things down. Not a diary. Something more specific. A record. Every visit from Aldane, noted with date and time and as close to verbatim an account as she could reconstruct from what she'd witnessed or what Cole had told her. The business with Birch and the feed store, documented with dates and specific items refused. A note about the lawyer in town who'd suggested selling. The first visit she'd seen Aldane make in September, the way Levi had gone still and said he wants our land with the flat certainty of a child who had heard something said too many times. She'd also written 2 letters. One to a journalist named Elias Kraft at the Helena Courier, who wrote about land and water disputes in the territory, and whose column she'd read at the hotel in Harlan's Crossing during her first stranded days there. She had introduced herself as someone with information about a pattern of property acquisition in the Flat Creek Valley and asked whether he'd be interested in knowing more. The second letter she'd sent to a land records office, requesting publicly available documentation on every property transaction along Flat Creek in the past 3 years. She hadn't told Cole about either letter. She wasn't sure yet whether that was prudent or presumptuous, and she turned it over while she sat with Levi at the table and helped him work through a passage from the geography book he'd selected himself. Not because she'd assigned it, but because he'd wanted to know where rivers went. Do all rivers end at the ocean? He asked. Most of them. Some end in lakes. Some just absorb into the land. What happens to the water then? It goes into the ground, then it comes back up in spring sometimes, or it goes into the water table and other things drink from it. He turned this over with the seriousness he brought to all such questions. So the water never really stops. No, she said, it just changes where it is. He seemed satisfied by this and went back to reading. She went back to her records. Basit. Cole came back from the neighboring ranches in the late afternoon with the expression of a man who had received both more and less than he'd hoped for. Henderson will talk, he said, pulling off his coat at the door. He's had 2 approaches from Aldane already. Not offers, just conversations. Friendly ones. The kind that let you know someone's watching. And the others? Pratt won't commit. He's got a sick wife and he can't afford trouble. He sat down heavily. 2 of the smaller operations said they'd wait and see. Wait and see means they'll move with whoever looks like winning, Claire said. Yes. He looked at the fire. Henderson's enough for now. He knows people in Helena, has for years. Good. She brought him coffee and sat across from him, and then she said, I need to tell you something I've been doing. He looked at her. She got the notebook from her room. She set it on the table in front of him and explained the dates, the record keeping, the pattern she'd been documenting, the 2 letters she'd sent. She kept her voice level and didn't frame it as an apology because she didn't think it required one, but she also didn't minimize what she'd done without telling him. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking at the notebook. You wrote to the courier, he said. Yes. Without telling me. Yes. He looked up at her. She held his gaze and didn't add anything. If Aldane finds out someone's been writing to journalists, he'll find out eventually regardless, she said. The question is whether there's something documented before he does. Cole put his hand flat on the notebook. He looked at it, at her neat handwriting covering page after page, with dates and facts and precise language, and she couldn't quite read his expression. It was layered, the way his expressions usually were, when something had moved through whatever compartment he kept things in and come out somewhere unexpected. "You've been doing this since September," he said, "since the day Aldane came and Levi told me he wanted your land. You believed a 9-year-old. "I believed what I saw in his face when Aldane rode up," she said. "Children don't perform fear." Cole was quiet again. Then he pushed the notebook back across the table toward her. "Keep going," he said, and then, "Show me what you've got so far." They sat at that table for 2 hours, going through it together, and she saw him do something she hadn't seen him do before. Think out loud. Not much, not fluently, but in pieces. When he knew something she hadn't recorded, he told her. When she'd gotten a date wrong by a day, he corrected it. When she connected 2 events that hadn't seemed connected, he went very still and said, "I didn't know he'd talked to the mill before October. I thought that was later." And she watched him rearrange something in his understanding of the situation, the way you rearranged furniture you'd lived with for so long you'd stopped seeing it. "He's been at this longer than I knew," Cole said finally. "Yes." He closed the notebook. "We need that Helena lawyer." "I agree. And I may have another contact if the journalist responds." She paused. "I also want to write to the county land office directly. If Aldane's transactions along the creek involve anything irregular, they won't look irregular. He's too careful for that." "Maybe. But irregular and legal aren't always the same thing, and the difference sometimes shows up in timing." She took the notebook back. "Let me look at the dates on the property transfers once I get those records back. There's something in the sequence that might matter." He looked at her across the table with an expression that had something new in it. Not quite surprise exactly, more like the adjustment a person made when they'd been expecting one thing and gotten another. She'd seen people look at her that way before, usually when they'd assumed she was less capable than she was and had to revise the assumption. It never stopped being slightly exhausting. "You've done this kind of thing before," he said. It was not quite a question. "My father was a merchant. He had disputes with suppliers twice that went to arbitration." She straightened the notebook. "I kept his records and sat in on both of them. He won one and lost one. The one he lost was because the documentation wasn't tight enough." Cole absorbed this. "Which one had tighter documentation?" "The one he won," she said. Whoops. November deepened, and with it came cold that settled into the bones of the ranch house and required constant management. The fire, the water pipes, the animals. Clara adapted her days around it. Lessons in the morning by the stove, afternoons that increasingly involved practical tasks alongside the boys because there was too much to do and too few people to do it, and because, she'd found, Noah learned more readily when his hands were occupied. She was showing Levi how to inventory the root cellar, a task she'd taken over from Noah, who had better things to do with his precision than count turnips, when she heard the horse come up the main road. 2 horses, actually. She came up from the cellar to look. Aldane again. And this time he'd brought someone, a man in a suit that was wrong for a ranch visit, the kind of suit you wore to a courthouse or a bank. He had papers in his hand before he'd even dismounted. Cole came from the barn. Clara stayed near the cellar doors, close enough to hear, far enough not to insert herself into it. Levi appeared at her side, silent. "Mercer," Aldane said, in the same pleasant tone he always used, the one that reminded Clara of a door that looked ordinary and locked from the outside. "This is Mr. Tallow. He represents the county court." "What court?" Cole said. "There's been a complaint filed," Tallow said. He had the practiced neutrality of a man who delivered papers for a living and had learned not to have opinions about their contents. "Regarding the welfare of minor children residing at this property, we're required to conduct an inquiry." The silence lasted about 3 seconds. Clara counted them. "A welfare inquiry," Cole said. His voice was absolutely flat. "On whose complaint?" "The complaint is filed anonymously," Tallow said. "Standard procedure in these matters." "Standard procedure." Cole looked at Aldane. Aldane was looking at the mountains with the expression of a man enjoying the view. "Mr. Mercer," Tallow continued, I'm required to inform you that if the inquiry finds the children's situation to be inadequate, temporary guardianship may be—" "No," Cole said. "Mr. Mercer, this is illegal. My sons are healthy and cared for and in school," Cole said. "You're welcome to come inside and see that for yourself right now. And then I'd like you to tell me who filed this complaint, because I know the rules and anonymous filing still have a filer, and that filer is someone you have a legal obligation to identify to me." Tallow's practiced neutrality slipped slightly. He looked at his papers. "I'll need to speak with the children separately. You can speak with them at the table in my kitchen, with Miss Whitmore present." Cole turned and walked toward the house. "Come inside, Mr. Tallow. Mr. Aldane, you can wait with your horse." Clara caught the slight movement in Aldane's face, something that crossed it quickly, not quite displeasure, more the minor recalculation of a man who'd expected more disruption and got less. He said nothing. She took Levi's hand and followed Cole inside. The inquiry lasted 40 minutes. Tallow asked both boys questions in the wooden procedural way of someone working through a list. Were they fed? Were they warm? Did anyone hurt them? Were they in school? Noah answered each question in 3 words or fewer, with the expression of someone enduring a mild insult. Levi answered with uncharacteristic directness, looking straight at Tallow, and at one point said, "Miss Whitmore teaches us every day. She made me better at reading." He said it with such factual earnestness that Tallow wrote it down and said nothing to it. When he spoke to Clara, he asked how long she'd been at the ranch, what her qualifications were, and whether she had concerns about the children's welfare. "No concerns," she said. "They're 2 of the more capable children I've taught." He wrote that down too. Cole walked him out. Clara stayed at the table with the boys, and after a moment Noah said, without looking up from the book he'd opened, "Aldane did that." "Probably," Clara said. "Can he take us away from the ranch?" She looked at him directly. "Not if I have anything to say about it." "You're not our parent," he said. It wasn't cruel, just accurate, the way Noah was often accurate. "No," she said. "But I'm here, and I'm staying, and there are things I can do that your father can't do at the same time as running this ranch." She met his eyes. "So between the 2 of us, I think we cover most of it." He looked at her for a moment with that evaluating expression he'd carried since the first day, and then he closed his book and went to help with the afternoon chores without another word. She took it as the acknowledgement it was. Cole came back inside. He sat down at the table and put both hands flat on it and looked at them. "He's escalating," he said. "Yes. The welfare complaint was a message. He couldn't get me through the supply chain alone, so now he's telling me what the next step looks like if I don't sell. He's telling you he has reach into the legal system." "Which he does." Cole's jaw was tight. "The lawyer he's got, Renfrew, has connections in the county court that go back 15 years. If Aldane decides to actually push the welfare case, he can make it last long enough to be damaging even if I win." "Then we don't fight it on that ground," Clara said. "We take the ground from under him somewhere else." She got her notebook. "The land records I requested came back last week. I've been going through them." She had. At night, after the boys were in bed, with a lamp and a piece of paper where she'd been mapping the timeline of Aldane's acquisitions along the creek. And there was something there. She'd found it 2 days ago and had been turning it over, making sure she was reading it right before she said anything. "The Henderson property," she said. "Aldane bought it in March of last year, except the water rights transfer to his name is dated 6 weeks earlier, in January, before the sale was finalized." Cole stared at her. "That's not possible. You can't transfer water rights on a property you don't own." "You can't legally," she said, "but the document exists. I have a copy." She turned the notebook to show him the transcribed details. "Which means either someone in the county recorder's office made a serious clerical error, or someone in the county recorder's office did something that wasn't a clerical error." Cole looked at the dates. He looked at them for a long time. "If that transfer was fraudulent," he said slowly, "then every subsequent transaction that relied on that water rights ownership could be clouded. Yes." She kept her voice even. "It might not unwind everything he's done, but it would give a lawyer something real to work with, and it would give that journalist something real to write about. Have you heard back from Kraft, the journalist?" Yesterday, she said. He's interested. He wants the documentation. Cole sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at her. When were you going to tell me about the records? When I was sure I was reading them right, she said. I didn't want to hand you something that turned out to be nothing. He was quiet for a moment. Then, is it something? Yes, she said. I think it is. The barn fire happened on the first Friday of December. Clara woke to the smell of it, that particular thick animal smell of burning hay and wood, and was out of bed and dressed before she was fully conscious of deciding to move. She came out of the house into cold air and orange light, and the barn was fully involved on the east wall, flames climbing the dry wood with the voracious efficiency of fire that had had time to establish itself. Cole was already there, and Noah beside him, and they had the bucket chain going from the water trough, a futile gesture against a fire that size, but the right futile gesture because the horses needed to come out and the fire needed to be kept from the house. She fell into the chain without being told, taking a bucket from Noah and passing it forward, and the cold water sloshed on her coat and her hands went numb within 10 minutes, and she kept going. Levi was on the porch. She told him to stay there, and he had, wrapped in a blanket, watching with huge dark eyes. They saved the horses. They lost the barn. By dawn it was down to smoking timbers and a floor of ash and the acrid, depressing smell of destruction that had finished and left nothing to fight. Cole stood at the edge of it with soot on his face and his hands and said nothing. Noah stood beside him. Clara went inside and made coffee and put food on the stove and came back out with coffee in the cracked cup, Cole's cup, and handed it to him without saying anything because there was nothing to say that helped. He drank it. After a while he said, "The east wall. It started at the east wall." "I know," she said. "There's nothing on the east wall that starts a fire." "I know." He drank more coffee. "I can't prove it." "Not yet," she said. He looked at her sideways. "The timber that burned on the east wall," she said. "It'll have burned differently if something was put on it to start it. I don't know enough about fire to say what to look for, but Henderson might. Or there'll be someone who does." She paused. "Don't let anyone touch it until someone who knows has looked at it." He handed her back the empty cup. "I need to rebuild before the hard freeze." "I know. The neighbors will help. Henderson will come. You don't know that." "He's that kind of man," she said. "I can tell." Cole looked at the smoking ruins of what his father had built and what he had maintained for 20 years, and his face held something that she finally recognized for what it was. Not because it looked like grief, but because she knew grief well enough to find it in unexpected shapes. It looked like this sometimes, like absolute controlled stillness, like a person holding themselves together with nothing but the habit of doing so. "Cole," she said. He looked at her. "He can't burn down what matters," she said. "The boys are safe, the house is standing, everything else we can build back." He held her gaze for a moment, and she could see him processing that. Not the words exactly, but the fact of her saying them, of her still being there at dawn with soot on her coat, having stayed in the bucket chain until there was nothing left to pass. Something in his expression shifted, almost too small to see, a fraction of the wall. He nodded, once, and turned to go back to work, and she went inside to feed the boys breakfast before the cold could set in worse than it already had. Henderson came that afternoon without being called. He brought 2 of his ranch hands and a load of timber from his own supply, and said only, "Let's get the frame up before it snows," which was the most efficient form of solidarity Clara had encountered. She went out with the men and worked alongside them, handing timber and holding things in place and keeping the coffee coming. And by late afternoon they had a frame that stood against the sky in the cold light and looked like something again. Noah worked beside the men without being asked. He was 11 and not as strong as the adults, but he was precise and he didn't stop. And Clara watched Henderson notice it, the way the boy moved, the efficiency of it, the absence of wasted motion, and nod to himself with the approval of a man who recognized good work. That evening, when Henderson stayed for supper, he brought something else with him. "Aldane's man Tallow has filed with 2 more county offices," he said, over the table. "Same kind of thing. Welfare inquiry on the Pratt children and some kind of easement dispute with the mill, all in the last week." "He's moving faster," Cole said. "He's moving because something spooked him." Henderson looked at Clara. Someone sent documents to the county land office in Helena questioning the water rights transfer on my old property. There was a silence. The transfer in January of last year, Clara said. Henderson looked at her steadily. That's the one. That was me, she said. Cole was very still. I sent the same documentation to the Helena Courier, she said, along with the record I've been keeping of Aldane's actions since September. She looked at Cole. I should have told you before I sent it. I didn't because I wasn't sure it would go anywhere, and I didn't want to raise something that might come to nothing. She paused. That was wrong. I should have told you and let you decide. The table was quiet. Then Henderson said with something in his voice that was almost a laugh, The Courier's planning to run a piece. Their man Kraft has been talking to 3 other families along the creek, apparently. He got their names from your documentation. He looked at Clara again. You cross-referenced the affected properties. I had the land records, she said. It wasn't complicated. It was damn thorough, Henderson said. Cole was still looking at her. She met his eyes across the table and waited for what she'd earned. The right to be told directly that she'd acted beyond what was hers to act on, that she'd put his name and his legal situation into the hands of a journalist without his consent. She was prepared to take that straight. How long ago did you send it? He said. 3 weeks? Before the fire? Yes. He breathed in slowly. If Aldane knows you sent it, the fire might not have been only about the land, she said. Yes, I've thought about that. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked up, and what was in his face was not anger, not precisely. It was something more complicated than anger, moving underneath it like water under ice. After supper, he said. We need to talk. Henderson left after dark, and the boys went to bed, and the house went quiet except for the fire. Cole sat across from her at the table, and she sat across from him, and neither of them spoke for a moment. You've been doing this since September, he said again, the same words he'd used before, but with a different weight now. Yes. You took my fight to a journalist without asking me. Yes. He looked at the table. Why? She thought about how to answer that honestly, without making it about something it wasn't. Because I could see what was happening, and I had tools to help, and I used them, she said. I told myself I was waiting until I was sure it was something. That was partly true. She paused. The other part was that I knew you'd say no, or wait, and I thought waiting was costing you more than moving would. It wasn't your call, he said. No, she agreed. It wasn't. He was quiet for a long time. The boys, he said. If Aldane pushes the welfare case and it drags into next year, if he ties me up in legal proceedings long enough. He stopped. She understood what he wasn't saying. A man fighting a legal battle while rebuilding a barn and running a ranch alone was a man who could be made to look, on paper, like a man who couldn't manage. It didn't matter that it was manufactured. Paper was paper. There's something I need to ask you, Cole said. She looked at him. It would help. Legally, in terms of the welfare inquiry, if you weren't the employee. He said it with the careful flatness of a man who had rehearsed it and still wasn't sure of the delivery. If you were, he stopped again, started over. I'm not asking for anything other than what's already here, what's already the arrangement as it is. He was looking at the table, and she could see the discomfort in him, not shame exactly, but the particular difficulty of a man saying something he'd turned over many times and still couldn't make land right. A wife can't be dismissed as a hired woman with no stake. It changes what Aldane can do legally with the boys. Clara looked at him for a long moment. He looked up. I'll only do it on one condition, she said. Name it. I'm not a solution to your legal problem, she said. I'm a person. If we do this, we do it as partners. Decisions about this land, the boys, everything that happens on this ranch, we make them together. I don't manage the household while you manage everything else. I don't get told things after the fact. We are equal in this, or we don't do it. He held her gaze. She could see him weighing it, not reluctantly, but seriously, the way he weighed everything. I haven't been easy to talk to, he said finally. No, she agreed. You haven't. I'll try to be better at it. I know you will, she said. I've seen you try before. With the boys. She let that sit for a moment. That's why I'm saying yes. He looked at her across the table, and the fire was low and the house was quiet, and outside the Montana cold pressed against every wall, and something passed between them that was not romantic and not simple and was entirely real. The recognition of two people who had both been carrying too much and had, without planning it, ended up carrying it in the same direction. All right, he said. All right, she said. She went to bed and lay awake a while listening to the wind, and thought about what she'd agreed to. Not with doubt, and the house held against it, and she let herself sleep. They were married on a Wednesday morning in December, in the front room of the ranch house, with Henderson as witness, and his wife Eleanor as the second, and a justice of the peace named Aldous Briggs, who drove out from Harlan's Crossing in a coat that was too thin for the weather, and kept his remarks brief, because he could see from the faces in the room that brevity was appropriate. Noah and Levi stood near the fireplace. Noah had his arms at his sides instead of crossed, which Clara had come to understand was his version of making an effort. Levi had combed his hair with such thoroughness that it was still damp at the temples, and he watched the brief ceremony with the focused attention he brought to things that mattered to him, but that he hadn't fully decoded yet. Cole said the words steadily and without embellishment. Clara said them the same way. Briggs pronounced them married, signed the paper, and accepted the coffee Eleanor pressed on him before heading back out into the cold. Henderson shook Cole's hand. Eleanor hugged Clara with the warm, practical efficiency of a woman who had decided to like her some weeks ago and was now formalizing it. Then they left too, and the four of them, Cole and Clara and the two boys, were alone in the front room with the fire going and the wind outside and the particular quiet of something that has just changed. Levi looked between them. "Do we call you something different now?" he asked Clara. "What did you call me before?" "Miss Whitmore." "You can call me Clara," she said. "If you want." He tried it out. "Clara." He nodded, apparently finding it acceptable, and went to get his book. Noah said nothing, but that evening at supper he passed her the bread before she reached for it, which was the first time he'd done that, and she received it without comment, and passed the butter back, and the meal went on. The Helena Courier ran Elias Craft's piece on the 14th of December. Clara read it at the kitchen table, the newspaper folded twice because the pages were large and the table was not, with coffee going cold at her elbow. Craft had done more than she'd hoped. He'd gone further back than her documentation, finding 2 property transactions from 1879 that showed the same irregularity with water rights timing, which meant the pattern predated Aldane's activities in the Flat Creek Valley by several years. He named Aldane directly. He named the lawyer Renfrew. He named the county recorder's office without accusing any specific individual, which was careful enough to be published and specific enough to be damaging. He had included a line, one line, that she hadn't given him, which meant he'd gotten it from someone else along the creek. Sources describe a pattern of pressure applied to property owners, including supply chain interference, anonymous legal complaints, and at least one instance of property destruction under suspicious circumstances. She set the paper down. Cole was already out. She could hear the boys overhead. She sat for a moment with her hands around the cold coffee cup and let the thing she'd been working toward for 3 months arrive as an actual reality rather than a strategy. The words in print, the name in ink, the pattern made visible. It was not victory. She knew better than to call it that yet. But it was the first thing that had happened that Aldane couldn't quietly redirect or quietly undo, and that was something. She brought the paper out to Cole at the barn. He read it standing up, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. When he finished, he folded it carefully and looked at the mountains for a moment. "Renfrew is going to tell Aldane within the hour," he said. "Probably. And Aldane will know you're the source. Kraft protected me. He didn't use my name. But yes, Aldane will know." She looked at him. "Are you worried?" He considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things. "About you," he said. "Not about the piece." "I'm not worried about me." "I know you're not," he said. "That's why I am." She took that for what it was, not overprotection, but the particular concern of a person who had lost someone before and had reorganized his entire emotional architecture around not losing anyone again. She didn't dismiss it. "I'll be careful," she said. "More careful than you've been," he said. And it wasn't a criticism exactly, more a statement of the minimum required adjustment to his continued peace of mind. "More careful than I've been," she agreed. He handed back the newspaper. She noticed he'd folded it so the headline was on the outside, and she thought, he's going to read it again later. She went back to the house, fogged. Aldane came 3 days after the piece ran. He came alone this time, no suited man with papers, no second horse. He rode up in the early afternoon when she knew Cole was in the south field mending fence, which meant either he'd timed it or it was coincidence, and she decided immediately that with Aldane nothing was coincidence. She was on the porch when he arrived. She had been there for 10 minutes before he rode up, because she'd heard a horse on the road a quarter-mile out and recognized the particular cadence of a single rider moving with purpose and unhaste. She'd stayed on the porch because going inside would have looked like retreat, and going inside also meant Aldane on her doorstep instead of her porch, which was a meaningful difference. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. It was the first time anyone had called her that outside of the immediate household, and she noted it, that he'd used it deliberately, that it was meant to communicate something, though she couldn't tell yet exactly what. "Mr. Aldane." He didn't dismount. Some people stayed on their horses to retain a height advantage. Others did it as an expression of how long they intended to stay. With Aldane, it read more like the latter, which she found interesting. "I saw the piece in the Courier," he said. "Most people in the territory have by now, I'd imagine. It contains a number of inaccuracies." "You should write to the editor," she said. "Kraft's name is on the piece. He'll respond to specific corrections." Something moved across Aldane's face. Small, controlled, the kind of micro-expression that appeared and disappeared in under a second. "It also contains information that could only have come from private documentation," he said. "Someone's been keeping records." "People keep records of all kinds of things," Clara said. "Farmers especially. Land, weather, transactions. It's practical." He looked at the mountains. "I want you to understand something, Mrs. Mercer. I don't have any quarrel with your husband. I've always found Cole to be a reasonable man. My interest in this valley is straightforward. I want to develop the water resources along the creek in a way that benefits the entire community. That's been my intention from the beginning." "And the Henderson water rights transfer 6 weeks before the sale closed," she said. "Was that also for the community's benefit?" The silence lasted about 4 seconds. "Clerical error," he said. "That's what I assumed you'd say," she said. "The county land office in Helena has a different opinion, as does the attorney Cole has retained there." Aldane looked at her directly for the first time since he'd ridden up. He had pale gray eyes that assessed things with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent decades reading situations and people. And she understood that he was doing exactly that now, taking her measure, recalibrating what he was dealing with, adjusting his picture of the situation to account for the woman on the porch, who was not what he'd expected her to be. "You're not from here," he said. "No. You came out here with nothing. Gerald Puett left you stranded in Harlan's Crossing with nothing, and you married Cole Mercer 3 months later." He said it with the smooth reasonableness of a man who wanted her to hear the subtext without him having to say it directly, that her position was manufactured, her stake was borrowed, her standing in this conversation was contingent on a marriage that had been, however she might characterize it, a practical arrangement. She let him finish. Then she said, "Are you making a point?" "I'm saying that you're new to this valley and to this fight, and there are ways this goes that you don't fully understand yet." "Tell me one," she said. He looked at her. "Tell me one way this goes that I haven't accounted for," she said, "because I've been thinking about it since September, and I'd genuinely like to know if there's something I've missed." The silence was longer this time. She held it without filling it, because she'd learned early in her teaching years that silence was only uncomfortable if you let it be, and the person who broke silence first usually did so because it cost them more. Aldane broke it. "You're going to find," he said carefully, "that this territory has long memories and short patience for people who cause problems." I'll keep that in mind, she said. He looked at her for one more moment, then turned his horse and rode out the way he'd come, and she watched him go and stood on the porch until the sound of the horse faded, and then she went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and let her hands shake for about 30 seconds, which was what they'd been wanting to do since he rode up. And then they stopped, and she got back to work. Pause. She told Cole that evening, all of it, as precisely as she could reconstruct it. He listened without interrupting, which was how he listened to things that concerned him, with complete stillness, tracking every detail. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He rode out here knowing I wasn't here, he said. Yes, that's a message. I know. She looked at him. I wasn't frightened. You said your hands were shaking. After, she said, not during. That's the order that matters. He sat back. What did you think he wanted from coming here directly? To see whether I'd fold, she said. He expected someone easier, a woman who'd stepped into a complicated situation and would step back out if the situation got uncomfortable. She paused. He's recalibrating now. That might make him more careful, Cole said, or more aggressive. I think more aggressive, she said. Patient men move slowly until they know waiting isn't going to work. Then they move fast. Cole looked at the table. The Helena lawyer, Marsh, he says the water rights documentation is enough to cloud Aldane's claim on the Henderson property and potentially 2 others. That's not enough to unwind everything, but it creates legal uncertainty, and legal uncertainty is expensive to maintain. Expensive enough to make him look at other options? Maybe. He rubbed the back of his neck. Marsh also says the welfare inquiry is weak. Without a named complainant and with 2 witnesses, Henderson's wife and now you, who can speak to the boy's situation, it's unlikely to go anywhere. He's filing a response this week. Good, she exhaled. The courier piece? Has anyone else reached out? Henderson said a rancher from up near Billing Creek contacted him. Same pattern. Aldane's made approaches, supply chain pressure, the same sequence. Cole looked at her. He wants to know who put the records together. Tell him to write to me, she said. I want his dates. If the pattern goes north of the valley, that changes the scale of what Kraft can report. Cole looked at her with that expression again, the one she'd stopped trying to fully decipher, that lived somewhere between respect and something more personal that neither of them had put language to yet. You know this is going to take months, he said, even if everything goes right. Legal processes, the inquiry, the county recorder investigation. I know, she said. I'm not in a hurry. You've been here 4 months. And I expect to be here considerably longer, she said, which was almost exactly what she'd said to Mrs. Fortner at the schoolhouse in the first week, and she recognized the echo of it, how far the same words carried from where she'd started. January came with weather that made December look gentle, and the practical demands of the ranch during the hard freeze pushed everything else to the margins for 3 weeks. The new barn frame held, which was a relief. Cole and Henderson had gotten the walls up before Christmas and the roof on the day after, working in temperatures that left frost on their beards and made tools dangerous to hold without gloves. The structure was simpler than the original. Less storage, the loft smaller. But it was sound and it was done, and the animals were in before the worst of January hit. Clara kept lessons going through the cold months, which required some adaptation. The main room was warmest in the mornings, so they worked there until noon. Afternoons were more flexible, and she began using them differently as the winter deepened. Noah had started bringing his notebooks to the table after lessons, the engineering notebooks, not the school ones, and working on what appeared to be a series of designs for a modified water pump, something he'd been thinking about since the previous summer when the hand pump on the east well had given them trouble. She didn't interfere with it. She provided him with a compass and a straight edge from her own supplies and said nothing else. And he produced 3 pages of drawings over 2 weeks that she wasn't qualified to evaluate, but that had the internal logic, even to an untrained eye, of something that had been thought through properly. Levi was reading novels by February. Not easily. He still moved through text more slowly than most children his age, still occasionally lost his place and had to backtrack, still sometimes confused words that looked similar on the page. But he was reading, And more than that, he was reading with the appetite of someone who had been given access to something they hadn't known they'd been hungry for. He read at the table after supper. He read in bed with a lamp until Cole told him twice to put it out, and then put it out, and then relit it when he thought the house was settled enough. Clara knew about the relighting and said nothing. She wrote to her former colleague in Pennsylvania again, requesting more books. She was specific about what she wanted, not primers, not moral instruction texts, but stories. Adventure, mostly. History, some. Things with people in them doing difficult things in difficult circumstances. Things worth reading all night for. The colleague sent 6 books and a note that said it sounds like you've found something worth staying for. Clara put the note in the tin box where she'd once kept $11.40, which now held other things. Letters, a photograph of her father, the first page of the land records documentation in her own handwriting. The $11 was long gone. The tin was fuller than it had been. In February, the county land office in Helena issued a formal finding. Marsh sent the letter with a brief cover note in his clipped, precise lawyer's handwriting. The finding supports the position that the January transfer of water rights on the Henderson parcel was executed without valid ownership of the underlying property. 2 additional transactions are under review. Aldane's attorney has filed objections. Expect a formal hearing in April. Clara read the letter 3 times. She was not one for dramatic responses to good news. She'd found that good news in complicated situations usually just meant the next hard thing had gotten somewhat more manageable, which was different from the problem being solved. But she read it 3 times. She brought it to Cole at lunch. He read it once, set it down, and ate his soup. April, he said. That gives us 2 months to prepare. Marsh will need the full documentation package. I'll have it ready by end of next week, she said. I've been adding to it. The rancher from Billing Creek sent me his dates. There are 8 more incidents that fit the pattern going back to 1880. Cole set his spoon down. 8. Aldane has been doing this for a long time, she said. We're not the only ones he's done it to. We're just the ones who documented it. He was quiet for a moment, with the expression of a man recalibrating the size of something he'd thought he understood. If the hearing goes in our favor. When? She said. He looked at her. When it goes in our favor, she said. Don't qualify it. I've spent 6 months building a case that holds. Let it hold. Something crossed his face that was almost a smile. Not quite, not the full thing, but the shape of one in the muscles around his eyes. When it goes in our favor, he said, his claims on the eastern section lose their legal foundation. Without the water rights chain, his leverage over the downstream properties is gone. And his arrangement with Renfrew becomes a liability instead of an asset, Clara said, because the lawyer who advised everyone to sell is the same lawyer who apparently didn't notice a fraudulent water rights transfer. She paused. Or did notice and didn't say anything, which is considerably worse for him. Cole picked his spoon back up. Marsh is going to want to talk to you directly before the hearing. I know. I've already written to him. He ate soup and looked at the window. You know what I keep thinking about? What? That first night at the Bear's Head, Frank Odell. He glanced at her. You walked into a saloon to pull a stranger out of trouble. It seemed like the thing to do. You didn't know me. You didn't know the town. You'd been there 3 days and everything had already gone wrong for you. He shook his head, not with wonder exactly, but with something more considered than that. Most people would have gone back to the hotel. Most people go back to the hotel, she said. That's not a criticism of most people. It's just not what I do. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. It's not. The way he said it, not compliment, not observation, just the plain recognition of a fact he'd learned about her and intended to keep knowing, was worth more to her than a great deal of more elaborate language would have been. March brought mud and the particular exhaustion of a frontier winter ending, not the clean relief she'd imagined when she first arrived, but a slow, incremental thaw that left the roads impassable for 2 weeks, and the yard a disaster, and everyone in the house slightly frayed at the edges from too many months of close quarters and cold. Noah snapped at Levi over breakfast one morning about the butter. Of all things, you always take too much every single morning. And Levi, who rarely raised his voice at anyone, said back with surprising heat, You count everything. You count how much butter everyone takes. That's a terrible way to live. Clara let it go for about 30 seconds and then said calmly, "Enough!" And both of them went quiet. And the morning continued with the constrained peace of two people who have said true things about each other and are not yet ready to address them. She mentioned it to Cole that evening, not as a problem, but as information. "They're at the age where they need more space than they're getting," she said. "Once the mud clears and the weather opens, I want to give them more time outside, Noah especially. He needs a project that isn't the kitchen table." "The pump design," Cole said. "You've seen it?" "He showed me last week." He paused. "It's good. It's actually, I think it could work. I'd want a proper engineer to look at it, but the basic mechanism is sound." Clara looked at him. "Tell him that." "I did." "What did he say?" Cole considered. "He said he knew." Said it with the particular dry flatness that was so specifically Noah that she could hear the boy's voice in it. But he looked pleased. She thought about the height marks on the wall in the kitchen doorway, the ones written in a woman's hand that stopped 3 years back. "Does he know you think he takes after your father?" she asked. "I've told him." "Does he know what that means to you?" Cole was quiet. "Probably not in the way it should," he said after a moment. The acknowledgement was not easy for him. She could hear it in the deliberateness of the words, the care being taken to be accurate rather than comfortable. "I don't say things like that well." "You're getting better at it," she said. He looked at her. "Am I?" "You told me what he looked like when you told him the pump design was good," she said. 6 months ago you wouldn't have noticed." He considered this with the serious attention he gave to assessments he was deciding whether to accept. "You're right," he said. "I wouldn't have." The April hearing in Helena required 3 days of travel each way, and Clara went with Marsh, leaving Cole at the ranch with the boys, and Henderson checking in daily because Marsh needed her testimony and her documentation, and because it was her work, and she intended to be there to see it through. She'd never testified before a formal hearing. She'd been in arbitration rooms and lawyers' offices, and once a county commissioners' meeting where her father's permit dispute got briefly contentious, but not a formal proceeding with a hearing officer and opposing counsel, and the specific pressure of legal language being used as a weapon by people who were good at it. Renfrew was there, representing Aldane. He was a small, precise man who asked questions the way you probed a wound, carefully, looking for the tender spot. He spent 40 minutes on her documentation, trying to establish that she'd been selective in what she'd recorded, that she'd had a personal interest in the outcome from the beginning, that her marriage to Cole was a calculated move rather than a legitimate arrangement. She answered every question without losing her temper, which cost her more than she showed. When he suggested that she deliberately targeted Aldane because of the pressure on the ranch's supply chain, implying she had a motive to fabricate, she said, "I targeted the documentation because I was keeping records of what happened. The supply chain interference is in the records because it happened. Those are the same thing. You can't know that Mr. Aldane was responsible for—" "I didn't claim to know it," she said. "I recorded what happened and noted the timing. The timing is what it is." Renfrew shifted. "Mrs. Mercer, you arrived in this territory with $11 and no prospects. 12 miles from where I'm sitting," she said. "I know exactly what I arrived with. It's not relevant to the water rights transfer dated January of 1882 that preceded the property sale by 6 weeks. Renfrew paused. He looked at his papers. He moved on. The hearing officer, a deliberate, gray-haired woman named Evelyn Strand, who had the air of someone who had heard a great deal of testimony in her life and had stopped being impressed by most of it, asked Clara 2 questions directly at the end of her testimony. She asked whether Clara had any financial interest in the outcome of the hearing beyond the value of the Mercer property itself. Clara said no. She asked whether the documentation had been altered or supplemented after the fact. Clara said no, and described the notebook's dating system, which Marsh had already entered into the record. Strand made a note and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Mercer," with the same inflection she'd used for every other witness, which told Clara nothing and told her everything. The woman was rigorous, and rigorous was what they needed. The hearing lasted 2 days. On the evening of the second day, Marsh took Clara to a quiet restaurant near the courthouse and ordered coffee and said, without preamble, "I think we have it." She looked at him. "Be specific." "The January transfer is the core," he said. Strand spent most of this afternoon asking Renfrew's witnesses about the recording process at the county office, and the way she was asking, she's already made up her mind about the transfer. The question now is how far she extends the finding. He added sugar to his coffee. If she limits it to the Henderson parcel, Aldane loses one transaction and nothing else. If she finds systemic irregularity, she extends it to the other two under review, Clara said, and potentially further depending on what the county recorder's office produces in their own investigation. Marsh drank his coffee. "Your cross-referencing of the Billing Creek incidents was important. Kraft's second article helped. The sheer volume of documented pattern is difficult to explain as isolated coincidence." She sat with that for a moment. "How long for the finding?" 2 to 4 weeks. She looked at the restaurant window, at the Helena Street visible through it, bigger than Harlan's Crossing, real sidewalks, gas lamps. A city? Or close enough. She thought about the ranch, about the boys waiting with Cole and Henderson checking in, about the mud clearing and the pump design on Noah's notebook pages, and Levi reading himself to sleep with the lamp he wasn't supposed to relight. "I need to get home," she said. Marsh smiled. "Train leaves at 8. 1. She was back at Mercer Flat on a Thursday evening, arriving as the light was going gold and low across the dry spring grass, the mountains in the north still carrying snow, but the valley floor green with the first real green of the year. Cole met her at the wagon. He'd been watching for her, which she knew because he came out of the barn before she'd pulled fully up, which meant he'd heard the road. He helped her down, which he rarely did, and didn't let go of her hand immediately after, which he'd never done before. She noticed both things. "How did it go?" he said. "Marsh thinks we have it," she said. 2 to 4 weeks for the finding." He held her hand for another moment. Then he let go and took her bag, and they walked toward the house. And on the porch, Levi was sitting with his book open on his knees, and he looked up when she came up the steps and said, in the tone of someone reporting important information, "Noah figured out the pump. He tested it on the east well this afternoon." "Did it work?" she asked. "Mostly," Levi said, which was such an accurate representation of how first tests of anything worked that she almost laughed. "Mostly is good," she said. "That's what Papa said." He went back to his book. She stood on the porch for a moment before going in. The valley was going amber in the last light, the grass moving in a small wind that had come down off the mountains clean and cold. 8 months ago, she had stood on a train platform with a trunk and a telegram and $11 and the complete absence of a future. She had stood there and decided not to get back on the train, which had felt at the time like stubbornness and felt now like something different. The particular clarity of a person who had run out of things to lose and discovered that running out of things to lose was actually a kind of freedom. She went inside. Cole had started supper. She washed her hands and stood beside him at the stove without saying anything, and he moved over to make room, and they cooked together in the easy and perfect way of two people who have learned each other's rhythms without intending to. Noah came in from outside with grease on his hands and the specific controlled energy of someone who has solved something they've been working on for months. He went to the basin, washed up, and sat down at the table. Then he said, to no one in particular, "It needs a different seal on the lower valve, but the mechanism works." "What would fix the seal?" Clara asked. "Rubber gasket. Birch probably has them." He paused. "Or had them before." "Birch has them," Cole said. "He came to me last week. Wanted to reestablish the account." Clara looked at him. "He heard about the Helena hearing," Cole said. "Word travels." He set a pot on the table. "I told him we'd think about it." "We should," Clara said. "He's not the enemy. He was pressured." "I know," Cole said. "That's why I said we'd think about it instead of no." Noah was looking between them with the expression of someone observing a functional system and noting how it worked. He didn't say anything. He picked up his fork. "Tomorrow," Levi said, settling into his chair with his book still in his hand, which Clara had long since stopped trying to separate him from at meals. "Can we go to the creek?" "If the mud's passable," Cole said. "It is," Noah said. "I checked." You checked the mud, Clara said. I needed to know if I could get the pump components to the east well without sinking, he said, with the air of someone explaining something obvious. The mud status was relevant information. Levi made a sound that was, unmistakably, a laugh. Quiet and short, quickly suppressed, but real. Noah looked at him. Something passed between them, the kind of private communication between brothers that didn't require words and wasn't really meant for adults to read anyway. Cole looked at Clara. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything, because nothing needed to be said. What was at the table, in that moment, in that house on that land that someone had tried to take and failed, was something that had been built, piece by piece, from the worst materials available: grief and stubbornness and practical necessity, and two people who couldn't afford to fail any more than they already had. It wasn't perfect. The barn was still simpler than the original. The legal finding hadn't come yet. Noah still kept his arms crossed more often than not. Cole still went quiet in ways that took her days to work around. She still second-guessed herself sometimes at 3 a.m. when the wind was loud and the darkness was complete, and the distance from everything she'd known felt like a physical thing pressing on her chest. But the boys were at the table, and the creek was running, and tomorrow they would go down to look at the water that someone had tried to take from them, and that was still, as it had always been, entirely theirs. The Courier's second piece ran the following week, and Marsh's letter arrived 2 weeks after the hearing with a finding that went further than either of them had hoped. 3 properties, systemic irregularity, a referral to the territorial attorney's office for further investigation into the county recorder's involvement. Aldane's attorney filed objections that Marsh described in his cover note as extensive, and I believe ultimately futile. Henderson came over and they sat on the porch in the April cold, and Cole brought out a bottle of something he'd been saving and poured 4 glasses. Himself, Henderson, Clara, and after a moment's consideration, Noah, who received his glass with the gravity of someone who understood this was an occasion, even if he wasn't entirely sure of all its dimensions. Levi got cider, which he accepted without complaint because Eleanor Henderson had brought a pie, and the pie was occupying most of his attention. "It's not over," Clara said, because it wasn't, and she'd found that people who declared things over before they were over made worse decisions in the aftermath than people who didn't. "No," Cole agreed. "But it's different now." "What's different?" Noah asked. Cole looked at his son. "He's playing defense now," he said, "instead of us." Noah considered this with the systematic attention he gave to things that had a mechanical logic to them. "So we just have to hold," he said. "We just have to hold," Cole said. The valley stretched out below the porch in the thin spring light, green and wide and threaded through by a creek that was running well with the snowmelt, water moving the way it always moved, through and under and around, finding every path available to it, going where it was going regardless of what anyone tried to put in its way. Aldane's formal objections took until June to exhaust themselves. Marsh wrote with updates every 2 weeks, careful, precise letters that Clara read at the kitchen table and summarized for Cole in the evenings, translating the legal language into plain terms the way she'd learned to do from watching her father's arbitration proceedings years ago. The objections followed a pattern she recognized. Each one was narrower than the last. Each one conceded a little more ground while trying to preserve whatever remained defensible. The way a man retreating through a burning building closed doors behind him. Not because the doors would hold, but because closing them bought 30 more seconds. By the end of May, 2 of the 3 disputed property transactions had been formally invalidated. The third, a smaller parcel on the northern edge of the creek, remained under review, tied up in questions about the county recorder's role that the territorial attorney's office was handling separately and slowly, the way government investigations always moved, with the grinding patience of institutions that had no personal stake in the outcome. Aldane himself had gone quiet. Not gone. Clara didn't make the mistake of assuming quiet meant absent. But the visits had stopped. The pressure on the supply chain had eased when Birch reestablished the account, and the feed store followed a week later. And the welfare inquiry had been formally closed in March, after Marsh filed the response that demolished it on procedural grounds. Frank Odell still drank at the Bear's Head in Harlan's Crossing, and Aldane still had property in the valley and money and the patience she'd always known he possessed. But something had shifted in the architecture of his position. The invisibility was gone. Kraft had published 3 pieces in the Courier by June, and 2 other papers in the territory had picked up the story. And a man whose tactics depend on nobody looking directly at them is considerably less effective once people have started looking. She said as much to Henderson one afternoon in late May when he came by to check the fence line on the shared boundary and stayed for coffee. "He's not finished," Henderson said. "I know," she said, "but he's slower now. Slower is enough, for the time being." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "Eleanor wants to know if you'd come to supper Saturday." "We'll come," she said, because she'd stopped qualifying invitations with, "I'll ask Cole months ago," not because she'd stopped consulting him, but because she'd learned that his answer to invitations involving the Hendersons was always yes, and saying "I'll ask" was a habit of her previous life that didn't fit her current one. After Henderson left, she stood at the kitchen window for a while, watching the yard, which had the specific late spring chaos of a working ranch, where too many things needed doing simultaneously, and every task completed revealed 2 more underneath it. Cole was by the new barn, talking to Noah. She couldn't hear them from the window, but she could read the body language. Cole pointing at something on the barn wall, Noah looking where he pointed, then saying something that made Cole tilt his head in the particular way he tilted it when someone had made a point he hadn't considered. This had been happening more. The 2 of them talking, not the careful, minimal exchanges of the first months she'd been here, when Cole moved through the ranch like a man conserving something that might run out, but actual conversations, sometimes long ones, sometimes at the table after supper when the work was done and the evening had room in it. She didn't know exactly when it had started. It had been gradual, the way thaws were gradual. Not an event, but an accumulation of small changes until one day the ground was soft where it had been frozen. She thought Cole probably didn't know exactly when it had started either. That was all right. The when mattered less than the fact. Noah installed the pump in July. It took him 2 full days and the help of a man named Garrett, who came down from Helena with Marsh on a visit and turned out to have engineering experience, real training, school trained, which Noah discovered within about 10 minutes of meeting him, and then spent the next 4 hours extracting every piece of relevant knowledge he could from the man with the focused efficiency of someone who had been waiting a long time for this particular conversation. Garrett looked at the pump design and said, "Who drew this?" "I did," Noah said. Garrett looked at him. Noah was 12 now, taller than he'd been at the start of winter, with the beginning of the angular quality that would define his face as an adult. He stood with his arms at his sides, not crossed, and met Garrett's assessment without flinching. "The lower valve seal solution is clever," Garrett said. "Where did you learn about fluid dynamics?" "I didn't," Noah said. "I worked it out from how the old pump failed." Garrett looked at the design again. Then he looked at Clara, who was standing near enough to hear. She kept her expression neutral, because Noah disliked being made a spectacle of, and she'd learned that the fastest way to close him up was to make his accomplishments into performances. But she saw Garrett register whatever was in her face and understand it, because he turned back to Noah and said simply, "Let's put it together then." And that was the end of the evaluation. The pump worked. It worked better than the old one, which had always required priming and lost pressure in cold weather. This one didn't have those problems. The redesigned valve held, the mechanism was more efficient, the water came up faster and more reliably than it had in the 10 years Cole had been managing that well. Cole stood at the well and ran water over his hands and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Noah." Noah was putting his tools away with his back turned. "What?" "This is a good piece of work." "I know," Noah said, in the flat, certain tone that had always carried within it. Clara had come to understand, not arrogance, but the particular defiance of a child who had decided to believe in himself precisely because he wasn't sure anyone else would. He put the last tool in the box and latched it. Garrett said the design could scale. Larger mechanism, same principle, could run irrigation. Cole looked at the pump. "That's a bigger project." "I know." Noah picked up the toolbox. "I'm not in a hurry." He carried it to the barn. Cole watched him go. Clara watched Cole. "He sounds like you when he says things like that," she said. Cole looked at her. "Like me." "The delivery," she said. "I'm not in a hurry. You say things exactly that way." He thought about this with the seriousness he brought to all observations about himself, which was one of the things she'd come to value most in him. He didn't deflect, didn't brush past them, actually considered whether they were true. His mother said, "I was the most patient, impatient man she'd ever met," he said. It was one of the first times he'd spoken of her directly, not in the oblique references that came through the boys, and she could hear the change in his voice when he did, not raw, not the acute pain of fresh grief, but the settled, carried weight of something that had been lived with long enough to be spoken of. "She was right," Clara said. He almost smiled. Almost. She usually was. He looked at the well again. "She would have liked you," he said. "She liked people who didn't back down from things." Clara looked at the water still running from the pump, clear and steady. "I think I would have liked her too." It was in the middle of that summer that Clara first talked seriously to Mrs. Fortner about the school. She'd been in town for supplies, Birch's, where she was now served without any of the former stiffness, the man having apparently decided that the path of least resistance was to pretend the previous winter had simply not happened, which Clara found pragmatic if not admirable, when she saw Mrs. Fortner coming out of the post office with a bundle of papers under her arm and the expression of someone carrying more than the papers accounted for. "Mrs. Mercer," Fortner said. "Mrs. Fortner." They stood on the boardwalk for a moment. Clara had not forgotten come back in the spring. If you're still here, she was not the kind of person who forgot things that had stung, but she'd also had time to understand that Fortner had not been cruel, only cautious in the way of someone responsible for an institution who couldn't afford to bet on someone who might disappear. She was still here. It was summer. That was the conversation they were implicitly having. "I hear the hearing went well," Fortner said. "Well enough," Clara said. "And Cole he's well." She paused. "I imagine you're short-staffed again. You mentioned it last fall." Fortner looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated gaze of a woman who had stopped bothering with indirection sometime in her 40s. "I have 17 children in that room in September, and one teacher who is 61 years old and not as fast as she used to be." "I'd need to be able to keep teaching the boys at home," Clara said. "Noah especially. What he needs isn't available in a one-room schoolhouse." "Part-time," Fortner said. "Mornings, Monday, Wednesday, Friday." Clara considered it. It would mean restructuring her schedule, rearranging when she did the ranch accounts. She'd taken over the bookkeeping in March, not because Cole couldn't do it, but because he did it in the same fragmented, late-night way he did everything, and the accounts needed more consistent attention. It would mean a longer day and less time for the correspondence that had become an important part of her own work. She'd become, somehow, a person that other women in difficult situations along the creek and beyond wrote to, not asking for legal advice exactly, more asking for the particular thing that was harder to name, what to do when you're in a place that doesn't know what to do with you. But 17 children in a room with a 61-year-old woman who was slowing down was something she could see clearly and do something about. "All right," she said. "September." Fortner looked at her for a moment with an expression that contained, buried under layers of professional reserve, something that might have been relief. "Good," she said, and went back to her papers. And that was that. But she told Cole that evening. He listened, asked 2 practical questions about the schedule, and said, "Henderson's oldest girl has been keeping accounts for the school on a volunteer basis. I can ask him to let her take on more so you have time. You don't have to. It works out," he said. "She wants the experience. You need the time." He picked up his coffee. "It makes sense." She looked at him across the table. This was what she'd asked for back in December, when they'd sat in this same room and made the arrangement that had become their life. Decisions together, a real partnership, nothing managed in parallel silos. He'd been better at it than she'd expected, which was not to say he'd been perfect at it. He still sometimes went quiet for days in a way that required her to circle back to whatever the original issue was and approach it from a different direction. He still occasionally made decisions about the ranch without looping her in until after the fact, not out of disrespect, but out of the deep ingrained habit of a man who had been entirely alone for 3 years and moved faster solo. But he corrected. That was the thing. When she pointed it out, he didn't defend it, he corrected it. That was rarer than it sounded in her experience. "Cole," she said. "Hmm? Are you all right with everything, how things have changed here?" He looked at her with the slightly puzzled expression he wore when she asked questions he found unexpectedly large for their apparent size. "What do you mean?" "I mean, the ranch is different than it was a year ago. The boys are different. I'm here." She paused. "It's a lot of change for someone who'd been in the same pattern for a long time." He sat with this for a moment. Outside the window, the summer evening was still light, the long Montana dusk drawing the sky out into colors that were never the same 2 nights running. "My father used to say that a ranch was only ever one bad winter away from being nothing," he said. He didn't mean it as a warning. He meant, you have to be willing to rebuild. It's part of what the work is. "And this year?" "This year I rebuilt," he said simply. Then, after a pause, "I didn't do it alone. That's different." He looked at the window. "That's better." She let that be what it was. Not wrapped up, not expanded into more than he'd said. Just received. September came, and with it, 17 children in Mrs. Fortner's schoolroom on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday mornings, and Clara Mercer standing at the front of a classroom for the first time in years, looking at the range of faces. Young ones, older ones, 2 children who clearly couldn't see the board well and needed to sit closer, 3 who were obviously bright and bored in the specific restless way of children who'd been waiting for something harder. She taught them the same way she'd taught Noah and Levi, not from the front of the room pushing information downhill, but by finding what each one was already moving toward and pointing it in a direction. The bored ones got harder problems. The struggling ones got different approaches. The 2 who couldn't see were moved to the front without fuss or comment, because she'd found that children who were accommodated matter-of-factly, without it being made into an event, accepted the accommodation and moved on. Mrs. Fortner observed the first Friday morning from the back of the room, said nothing during the lesson, and afterward told Clara, "You teach the way I used to teach, before I got tired." "You don't seem tired," Clara said. "I'm 61, Fortner said. "I'm tired. I just don't show it on school days." She picked up her coat. "I show it on Saturdays, and it's nobody's business." Clara found this funny and didn't hide it, and Fortner, who had apparently decided somewhere in the previous months that Clara had earned a more direct relationship, looked almost amused in return. It was not a warm friendship, not yet. Fortner was too guarded for warmth to come quickly. But it was real. And in the valley of things Clara had built that she hadn't expected to build, this was one of them. The territorial attorney's finding on the county recorder's office came in October, 14 months after Clara had first sent documents to the land office in Helena. It was not the clean vindication of a story that had been heading toward one. Nothing in the real sequence of events was ever that clean. The recorder himself was found to have accepted payments from Aldane in exchange for expedited processing of certain transfers, which was corrupt, but was also characterized in the finding as insufficiently documented to prosecute. 2 of his deputies had participated more directly in backdating the water rights documents. One resigned before the finding was released, the other was removed from his position and faced further proceedings that Marsh predicted would resolve slowly and inconclusively, as these things often did. Aldane was not charged with anything. This was the part that Clara sat with longest, on the evening the letter arrived. She sat with it at the kitchen table after the boys had gone to bed, and Cole was doing the accounts. She'd given them back to him temporarily while she was managing the school schedule adjustment, and she read the relevant section 3 times. "He's not charged," she said. "No." Cole's voice was even. "He corrupted the county recorder's office. He burned our barn. He filed a fraudulent welfare complaint about your children." She looked at the letter. "And he's not charged." "No," Cole said again. "But he lost." He set down his pencil. "He lost the Henderson property rights. He lost the other 2 transactions. His lawyer is under review by the bar. His name has been in 3 newspapers for 8 months. He paused. And every property owner along the creek knows what he tried to do and how far he got with it. Which is not far enough from nothing, she said. No, it's not. He was quiet for a moment. But he's not buying any more land along this creek. Not for a long time. She understood what he was saying, that imperfect outcomes were still outcomes, that the absence of a clean resolution was not the same as failure, that justice in the world she lived in came in fragments and approximations rather than complete units. She understood it intellectually, and she sat with the distance between understanding something intellectually and being satisfied by it. She was not fully satisfied. She probably wouldn't be. I wanted more, she said. I know, he said. It's not enough for what he did. No, he said. It's not. He didn't try to improve it, didn't add anything that made the insufficient thing seem sufficient. She was grateful for that. For his willingness to sit in the honest discomfort of it without performing resolution he didn't feel either. After a while she put the letter away. The accounting could wait. She made tea and brought a cup to Cole and kept one for herself, and they sat together in the quiet of the house, the way they'd learned to sit together over the months. Not filling the silence, not performing ease, just 2 people who had chosen to be in the same room, and were. The year turned, and the next one came, and the one after that, and Mercer Flat Ranch moved through them with the incremental, unglamorous accumulation of a life being built rather than received. The school grew. Clara had started with Fortner's 17 children. By the second spring, word had traveled enough that families from the outer ranches were bringing children in for the Monday, Wednesday, Friday sessions, which meant the 17 became 23, and 23 outgrew the schoolroom. The following fall, with Henderson's backing and contributions from 6 families along the creek, a second room was added to the schoolhouse building, and Clara became less of a part-time assistant and more of a co-director, which was not a title anyone gave her, but which described what was happening. Fortner ran the younger children. Clara ran the older ones, and she ran them the way she ran everything, with the expectation that they were capable of more than they'd been given credit for, and the patience to wait for them to arrive at it. She started something else, too, in the second year, a correspondence program for women on isolated ranches who had children too young or too far to come to town. She wrote curricula, simple and practical, designed to be followed without a teacher in the room. She wrote instructions that a mother who had herself been only minimally educated could follow, because on the frontier, minimal education was the norm, and you built from what existed rather than what you wished existed. She sent the first package to 3 families. By the end of the second year, she was sending to 11. By the end of the third, she'd lost count, because the families had started copying materials and passing them to neighbors, which meant the program had gotten loose from her management in the specific way that good things sometimes got loose from their origins and became something larger than any one person could track. Elias Kraft wrote a piece about it. She told him to focus on the families, not on her, and he mostly did. Yet, Noah left for Helena when he was 17. He'd been corresponding with Garrett for 2 years by then, and Garrett had arranged an apprenticeship with an engineering firm that worked on water infrastructure projects. Precisely, the thing Noah had been moving toward since he was 11 years old, watching the old pump fail. He packed a trunk that was more notebooks than clothes, shook Cole's hand with a formality that was very Noah, accepted Clara's embrace with the slight stiffness of a person who was not naturally expressive but who had learned over years that receiving affection was not the same as being overwhelmed by it, and got on the wagon to Harlan's Crossing on a cold November morning. Levi cried briefly with the specific embarrassment of a 15-year-old who had not planned on crying and was annoyed at himself for it. Noah pretended not to notice, which was the kindest thing he could have done and was, Clara thought, evidence that he'd learned something important about the difference between what was true and what needed to be said. Cole drove the wagon to town. Clara stood on the porch and watched it go, and felt the particular mixture of pride and loss that she suspected would characterize every departure she'd have to make peace with for the rest of her life. It was not clean. She hadn't expected it to be. She went inside and started the accounts and let the feeling do what feelings did, which was exist until they didn't, and then exist again later in a different shape when something reminded her. He wrote every 3 weeks. His letters were long and technical and included diagrams when words weren't sufficient, which was frequently. The third letter included a drawing of a water distribution system he'd been asked to help design, and in the margin he'd written, "The lower valve principle from the well pump works at scale." Garrett was right. Clara read that sentence 4 times, not because she didn't understand it the first time, but because she was 34 years old and had been someone's teacher, and was still capable of being moved by the specific moment when a child's early work turned out to have been the beginning of something real. She put the letter in the tin box, which was now a different, larger box, because the original tin had run out of room. Levi was a different kind of departure. He didn't leave so much as expand, which suited his nature better. He had become by 16 someone who understood people the way Noah understood mechanisms, intuitively, almost mechanically, reading how they fit together and where the pressures were, and what would hold and what would fail. He started working with Henderson 2 days a week, learning the business side of ranching, and Henderson, who had no sons and had been looking for someone worth teaching, found in Levi a student who combined his father's patience with his mother's talkativeness into something that was entirely its own thing. By the time he was 18, he was managing procurement for 3 ranches in the valley, negotiating supply arrangements with the same Birch, who had once canceled the Mercer account under Aldane's pressure, and doing it with a directness and fairness that people responded to because Levi had always understood, in his bones, that trust was a resource you built slowly and spent carefully. He came home for Sunday suppers and brought questions for Cole about the land, and questions for Clara about the school families, and questions for everyone about everything. Because he had never really stopped being the boy who wanted to know where rivers went, he'd just learned to ask about more complicated rivers. "You turned out well," Clara told him once, when he was 19. In the offhand way she said things she meant sincerely, but didn't want to make too heavy. "You sound surprised," he said. "Not surprised. Glad." She handed him more coffee. "There's a difference." He looked at her with the particular gaze he'd always had, the one that saw more than it let on. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd taken the return ticket?" he said. "That first day, at the station." She thought about it. "Sometimes." "What do you think?" "I think I'd have gone back to Pittsburgh and found some other version of this, eventually," she said. "Maybe. Or I'd have lived something smaller." She looked at her coffee. "I don't know. What I know is I didn't take the ticket." "Because of us?" he asked. "Or because of something else?" "Because I'd sold everything I had to get here," she said, "and I wasn't going to do that for nothing." She paused. "And because the ticket going back was someone else's idea of what I should do. I've never been very good at other people's ideas about that." Levi nodded with the satisfied look of someone who had confirmed something they already suspected. "That's what I thought," he said, and drank his coffee. Clara Mercer was 36 years old when the second room of the schoolhouse was completed. 38, when the correspondence program reached its 20th family. 40 when she stood in Mrs. Fortner's place at the front of the building and looked at 31 children and understood that Fortner had retired and she was running the school now, not as an assistant, not as a part-time teacher, but as the person who had built the second half of it. She was not remembered in Harlan's Crossing and the surrounding valley as the woman Gerald Puit had left stranded on the platform. That story had been true once and then had been superseded by other, more durable stories, the way all stories were, when enough time and enough events accumulated on top of them. She was remembered as the woman who had gone to Helena with a notebook and come back with a legal finding that changed the water rights situation for 7 families. As the woman who started the correspondence curriculum, as the teacher who had taught Noah Mercer, whose water distribution work in the Helena area had earned him enough of a reputation that engineers from further east sometimes wrote him letters asking questions. As the woman who had, in the particular calculus of how small communities assign significance, built something from nothing in a place that had initially decided she was nothing. She would have said she didn't care how she was remembered, and this was mostly true. She'd never built anything for the memory of it. She'd built things because they needed building, and she was there, and she could. But she was human enough to notice, on certain evenings, that the story had changed, that the abandoned bride who arrived with $11 had become something the Valley pointed to with the uncomplicated pride of people claiming ownership of a thing they hadn't originally wanted. She noticed it and was wry about it, and didn't hold it against them because that was also human, to reassess a person's value in light of what they turned out to be worth, and to forget you'd once thought otherwise. Cole was 51 that year. He had more gray in his hair and moved with the slight, careful deliberateness of a man who had spent 30 years of physical labor on unforgiving land and was paying some of that back now. He didn't complain about it. He adapted, the way he adapted to everything, practically, without drama, rerouting around what wasn't available and using what was. He talked more than he had when she'd met him. He still went quiet sometimes, still had the long silences that required her to circle back to them, but the silences were different now. Less like walls and more like rooms, places he went to think rather than places he retreated to in order to not be reached. She had learned the difference. It had taken time. There were things about their life together that were still imperfect and would remain imperfect, because that was the nature of any real arrangement between two people who were themselves imperfect and had come to each other already shaped by prior lives. He was sometimes too closed. She was sometimes too directive. He deferred to her on the school and the correspondents' families, and she deferred to him on the land and the cattle decisions, which was logical given their respective competencies, but also occasionally produced the friction of two people who had agreed to be equals and still had to negotiate what that meant in practice, moment by moment, without a template. But she had stopped wanting a template. Templates were for people who needed a guarantee, and she had understood somewhere in the first winter at Mercer Flat that guarantees were not what the frontier offered and were probably not what she would have trusted anyway. What the frontier offered was the work itself, the specificity of each problem and the tools available to address it. The way a solution arrived not as a complete thing, but in pieces, imperfect and revisable, requiring adjustment. The way people who stayed long enough and paid attention became, almost without noticing, necessary to the place they'd stayed. She had become necessary. She hadn't planned it. She had planned almost nothing, in the end, had arrived with a trunk and $11 and a future that had collapsed before it started, and had made decisions one at a time in response to what was directly in front of her. Don't take the return ticket. Don't sleep outside. Walk into the saloon. Say yes to the wagon. Say yes to the school. Keep the notebook. Send the letter. Say yes on your own terms and no one else's. It wasn't a philosophy. It was just how she'd lived. But looking back from the vantage point of the years that had accumulated, the school, the families along the creek whose children could read because of packages she'd mailed, the pump that worked on the scale Noah had imagined, Levi negotiating supply arrangements with the ease of someone who had never doubted he was capable of it, Cole on the porch in the evenings with his coffee and his willingness to say more than he once had. Looking back, she thought, this is what it looks like when someone decides not to let the worst moment be the final one. She hadn't been brave. She'd been stubborn, and stubborn had been enough. She hadn't been without fear. She'd been frightened many times, in the saloon, on the porch facing Aldan, at the hearing in Helena with Renfrew's questions coming at her like probes looking for the place she'd give way. She'd been frightened, and she'd kept going, which was the only version of courage she'd ever believed in. Not the absence of fear, but the decision that the fear was not the most important thing in the room. The most important thing in the room was always the thing that needed doing. She'd found over and over that there was always something that needed doing. And she'd found, more slowly, more reluctantly, because it required her to rely on people and she had not always been good at that she didn't have to do it alone. Cole came out on the porch as the evening light went gold across the grass, carrying 2 cups and the expression of a man who has spent the day doing physical work and is not displeased by this. He handed her a cup and sat down in the chair beside her, the one that had been beside hers for long enough that it had worn a permanent impression in the porch boards. "Heard from Noah," he said. "What did he say?" "The irrigation project is done. They're starting on a new one in the spring, further north." "Is he happy?" Cole considered the word with the seriousness he always brought to inexact terms. "He said the work is interesting," he said. "For Noah, that's the same thing." She drank her coffee. The valley stretched out below the porch in the last light, the creek glinting where it curved through the far pasture, the mountains going dark against a sky that was still pale gold and would stay that way for another hour. Somewhere behind them in the house, Levi's voice on his way out the back door, heading home to the Henderson place where he was staying most nights now. and his footsteps on the stairs and the door closing. The house was quiet. The valley was quiet. The work of the day was done, and the work of tomorrow was waiting, and between them was this, the porch, the evening, the accumulated weight of a life that had not been handed to anyone but had been built, choice by imperfect choice, out of the materials available. She had arrived in Montana believing she had lost her future. She had arrived with nothing, and that nothing had turned out to be, in its own way, a kind of freedom, because nothing meant there was nothing to protect, nothing to defend, nothing to lose that she hadn't already lost, which meant she could move in any direction without the weight of what she was risking. She had moved, and then she had stayed. And staying, it turned out, was its own kind of choice. Not less brave than moving, just different. The willingness to put roots into ground that had not asked for you, and to keep putting them down even when the ground pushed back, until the day came when the ground no longer pushed, and the roots held, and what had been a transaction had become, without any single moment you could point to, a life. Cole turned to look at her with the quiet attention he'd always had, and had learned, over years, to show more openly. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She looked at the mountains, at the creek, at the grass that had been here before her and would be here after. "The return ticket," she said. He looked at her. "I'm glad I didn't take it," she said. He was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was deciding whether to say the thing he was thinking or to let it sit. He'd gotten better at saying the thing. Not always, but better. "So am I," he said. The evening held them there, two people on a porch at the end of a long day, at the end of a long fight, at the beginning of whatever came next. And the light went slowly from gold to copper to the soft dark blue that preceded full dark. And the mountains became silhouettes, and the creek disappeared into the evening, still running as it had always run, through and around and under everything that tried to stop it, finding every available path, going where it was going,